Rain hammered the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Whitfield Global Industries boardroom like accusations nobody could outrun. 60 stories above Manhattan, the city below, dissolved into smeared light and shadow, a world rendered impressionist by the downpour, beautiful and blurred, and completely indifferent to the woman standing at the head of the conference table with her future balanced on a knife's edge. Serena Whitfield was 32 years old. She ran an $8 billion multinational corporation. She wore a Valentino suit in charcoal gray that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her expression could have been carved from the same marble that lined the lobby downstairs. 12 board members sat arrayed before her in leather chairs that swiveled with the precision of gun turrets, and every single one of them was aiming at her. Harold Patton spoke first. He always spoke first. Richard Whitfield's oldest friend and the company's chief financial officer for 2 decades, Harold had perfected a tone of gentle condescension usually reserved for bright children who'd wandered into rooms where adults were talking. The shareholders are nervous, Miss Whitfield. Your lifestyle choices have become a liability. Serena's fingers tightened around the presentation clicker until her knuckles blanched. She'd spent 6 weeks preparing the quarterly review. The numbers were exceptional. Market share up 18% in 2 years. 3 new international partnerships. A supply chain restructuring that had saved the company $40 million annually. None of it mattered, apparently, because she was unmarried. My lifestyle choices have nothing to do with the fact that I've increased our market share by 18% in 24 months. Her voice came out level-controlled, the product of a lifetime spent learning to swallow every inconvenient emotion before it could reach the surface. Margaret Harris leaned forward, the only other woman on the board, which somehow made what she said next sting worse than anything Harold could deliver. Your personal life is our business when it affects stock prices. The tabloids call you the ice queen, the untouchable heiress. That's not exactly the image of stability our investors want to see. Serena looked at Margaret and felt something cold settle behind her ribs. She'd mentored Margaret, recommended her for the board seat. And here Margaret sat, sliding the knife between Serena's shoulder blades with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned exactly where the vital organs were. In this room, loyalty was a currency that depreciated faster than cryptocurrency during a crash. I'm 32 years old. I run a multinational corporation. I don't need to be married to prove I'm stable. Actually, a voice cut through the room like a blade drawn from a sheath. You do. Charles Richard Whitfield emerged from the shadows near the window, where he'd been watching the proceedings like a director observing his play, from the wings waiting for the precise moment to step on stage and remind everyone who really controlled the theater. At 65, Richard Whitfield still commanded every room he entered through sheer gravitational force. Silver-haired, steel-eyed, and absolutely ruthless in the way that only men who'd built empires from the wreckage of their personal lives could be. He circled the table slowly, each step deliberate, a predator establishing territory. The merger with Mercer Technologies is our biggest deal in a decade. Marcus Donovan is old-fashioned. Family values. Legacy. He's made it clear he prefers to do business with settled individuals. Daniel Mercer, Serena corrected silently. Her father never could remember whether the man's name was Marcus or Daniel. It was Daniel, 73 years old, built his company with his late wife from nothing and still evaluated potential partners the way a farmer evaluated soil, by what it could sustain over generations, not what it produced in a single season. So I should get married to close a business deal. Serena's laugh was sharp enough to draw blood. This isn't the 19th century, father. No, it's worse. Richard stopped directly across from her, the mahogany table between them like a battlefield. It's the 21st century where perception is everyone and your image is hurting this company. So here's what's going to happen, Serena. You have 3 months to announce your engagement to someone suitable. Someone who makes you look human instead of a corporate machine. The room went silent. Not the comfortable silence of agreement, but the suffocating silence of a courtroom when the verdict comes back guilty. Serena looked around the table and saw it in their faces, the averted eyes, the studied neutrality, the carefully arranged expressions of people who'd already made their decision before she'd walked through the door. This wasn't an ambush. It was an execution, and they'd built the gallows while she was busy saving their quarterly earnings. And if I refuse, then the board will vote on your position as CEO. Richard glanced around the table with the casual confidence of a man who'd already counted his votes. I imagine you'll be offered a generous severance package and a seat on the board. Purely advisory, of course. Purely advisory. Translation, a gilded cage with no lock on the door because the door itself had been removed. She'd have the title, but none of the power. A corporate ghost haunting the hallways of a company that bore her name but no longer belonged to her. Serena's throat tightened. Not from sadness she'd cauterized that nerve-ending years ago, but from the particular fury of realizing that the man who'd taught her everything about power was now using those same lessons to strip hers away. Her mother, Eleanor, had died when Serena was 8. Heart condition, the doctor said, as if reducing a woman's entire existence to a faulty valve could explain the void she left behind. Serena had come home from school to find her mother on the kitchen floor still warm, the oven timer still counting down for cookies that would never come out. Her father had never mentioned Eleanor again. Not once. Instead, he'd raised his daughter in boardrooms and merger negotiations, taught her to read balance sheets before she learned to read people, and built her into the perfect corporate instrument. 24 years. She'd sacrificed relationships, friendships, every normal human experience that didn't directly serve the Whitfield name. She dated strategically when she dated at all, ended things cleanly when they threatened to become real, and constructed a life so precisely controlled that even her morning coffee order was optimized for maximum efficiency. All of it, every lonely holiday, every canceled dinner with someone she might have loved, every birthday spent reviewing contracts instead of opening gifts, all of it had been in service to this company and this man's approval. And it was never enough. 3 months, she repeated. 3 months, Richard confirmed. Find someone, Serena, or lose everything you've worked for. He walked out without waiting for a response because men like Richard Whitfield didn't wait. They declared, and the world rearranged itself to accommodate them. The board members filed out after him in a procession that felt uncomfortably like a funeral, and Serena stood alone in the empty boardroom, listening to the rain assault the glass, and wondering when exactly her life had become a trap she'd built with her own hands. She pressed her palm flat against the window. The glass was cold. 60 stories below, Manhattan churned on 8 million lives, intersecting and diverging in patterns too complex to map. And not a single one of them knew or cared that Serena Whitfield was drowning in the tallest building on the block. 3 months to find a husband. 3 months to convince a man she didn't know to play a role she couldn't stand in a performance designed to satisfy people she was beginning to despise. The sheer absurdity of it should have made her laugh. Instead, she picked up her phone, scrolled past 17 missed calls from Douglas Hartley, her father's handpicked candidate, a corporate lawyer with the charisma of damp cardboard, and 2 ex-wives who'd fled as soon as the ink dried, and set an alarm for tomorrow morning. 6 a.m., another day of proving herself to people who'd already decided she wasn't enough. The rain kept falling, the city kept spinning, and Serena Whitfield kept standing at the window alone, in a room full of empty chairs, trying to remember the last time she'd felt anything other than the weight of a name she hadn't chosen. 2 weeks dissolved like sugar in hot water, fast complete, leaving nothing behind but a faint sweetness that might have been nostalgia or might have been regret. Serena sat in bumper-to-bumper traffic on Route 87, her hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel of her Mercedes, watching brake lights pulse red in an endless rhythm that felt like the world's most tedious heartbeat. Her phone buzzed for the 14th time in an hour. She didn't need to look. Douglas Hartley had the persistence of a telemarketer and roughly the same ability to read social cues. 3 dinners together had confirmed what Serena already suspected: her father's definition of suitable and her own occupied different galaxies. Douglas talked about himself in the third person. Douglas used the phrase synergistic value proposition in casual conversation. Douglas had once sent back a bottle of wine at a restaurant because it was too atmospheric. Whatever that meant. The traffic lurched forward 1 car length, then stopped. Serena stared at the river of tail lights stretching toward the horizon and felt something crack, not dramatically, not the catastrophic failure of a dam, but the quiet fracture of a branch that's been bearing too much weight for too long. She jerked the wheel right, cutting across 2 lanes to a symphony of outraged horns, and took the exit marked Havenbrook 15 miles. She had no idea where Havenbrook was. She didn't care. She just needed to be anywhere that wasn't Manhattan, where everyone knew her face and everyone knew her failure, and everyone had an opinion about what Serena Whitfield should do with her life, except the one person whose opinion should have mattered most, Serena Whitfield. The highway surrendered to country roads, then to something barely qualifying as pavement. The Catskills rose around her like a cathedral built by someone who understood that the best architecture didn't need straight lines. Trees pressed in on both sides, their October leaves burning in shades of amber and crimson against an impossibly blue sky. She rolled down the window and let the wind destroy 2 hours of careful styling, and for the first time in weeks, her chest didn't feel like it was caving in. The air smelled like wood smoke and something sweet she couldn't identify. Maybe apple, maybe maple, maybe just the particular perfume of a world that existed outside conference rooms and power lunches. A bird called from somewhere in the canopy, and Serena realized with a start that she couldn't remember the last time she'd heard a bird. Manhattan had pigeons, but pigeons didn't count. Pigeons were just rats with better marketing. Then the oil warning light caught her eye. It was glowing orange on the dashboard, patient and insistent, and she realized with a sinking feeling that it had probably been glowing for a while. How long? She couldn't say. She was accustomed to having a driver accustomed to someone else worrying about fluid levels and tire pressure and all the mundane mechanics of keeping a machine alive. She'd been so lost in thought, in the spinning hamster wheel of her father's ultimatum, the board's betrayal, the suffocating mathematics of finding a husband in 90 days, that she'd driven right past every warning the car tried to give her. The engine coughed, shuddered, and died with the dignity of an old dog lying down for the last time. Serena coasted to the shoulder, which was generous terminology for a slightly flatter section of ditch. She stared at the dark dashboard. This car cost more than most people's houses. It was serviced monthly at the dealership. It did not break down on random country roads in the Catskills because its owner had ignored the oil light like a freshman ignoring a term paper deadline. Except it did, because even $8 billion heiresses weren't exempt from the laws of mechanical physics. She grabbed her phone. 1 bar of signal, the Catskill Hills ate cellular coverage the way Manhattan ate ambition, thoroughly and without apology. She managed to reach a roadside assistance service that promised a tow truck in approximately 3 hours delivery time, subject to the whims of geography and staffing and the general indifference of the universe toward stranded executives. 3 hours. Serena climbed out of the car in her Louboutins and pencil skirt, surveyed the wilderness surrounding her, and began walking. She didn't know what she was walking toward. She only knew that sitting in a dead car on the side of a road in the middle of nowhere felt too much like sitting in that boardroom, trapped, waiting, powerless, and she'd rather destroy a pair of $1,000 shoes than feel that way for one more minute. 20 minutes later, her feet screaming, her professional composure reduced to rubble. Serena spotted a building ahead. Not a gas station, not a convenience store, just a structure that represented the possibility of a telephone and a chair, and maybe, if the universe felt generous, a glass of water. As she got closer, the building resolved into a workshop. Weathered wood siding, the color of old honey, a hand-painted sign that read Callaway Woodcraft in letters that had been applied with care, if not professional skill, and a yard scattered with furniture that stopped Serena mid-stride. She'd spent enough time around expensive things to recognize quality when she encountered it, and what she was seeing in this yard wasn't just quality. It was art. A rocking chair sat near the entrance, its curves so fluid they seemed to have grown rather than been carved. The joints were perfect, she could see, even from a distance. The precise dovetails and mortise and tenon connections that spoke of someone who understood wood the way a surgeon understood anatomy. Not as raw material to be dominated, but as a living substance with grain and memory and preference, requiring partnership rather than force. Kitchen cabinets leaned against the wall, their panel details carved with an intricacy that would have been right at home in a museum. And scattered among the larger pieces, like notes in a musical score, were wooden toys, animals, cars, a castle with working drawbridge, each one made with a level of attention that mass production couldn't touch. Through the open workshop door, Serena could hear the whine of a saw. She'd never asked a stranger for help in her life. She'd never needed to. There was always someone paid to solve problems, an assistant, a driver, a concierge, a fixer. The entire architecture of wealth was designed to ensure that people like Serena Whitfield never had to stand in a sawdust-covered doorway with ruined shoes and ask a stranger for the use of their telephone. But here she was, and pride at this point was a luxury even she couldn't afford. She walked toward the workshop. Ethan Calloway was halfway through cutting a mortise joint when the voice reached him over the whine of the saw. He killed the power and looked up, expecting Mrs. Patterson from the general store, who usually stopped by Thursdays to check on her repaired kitchen chair. Instead, he found himself staring at a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine and gotten catastrophically lost. She was tall, maybe 5'9", with dark hair pulled back in a style that probably had a name he'd never learned. Her suit was clearly expensive. Even Ethan, who bought his clothes at the department store in the next town over, could recognize the difference between fabric that cost $20 a yard and fabric that cost $200. The hem was muddy, though, and one heel looked like it had lost a fight with a pothole. But it was her face that caught him. Sharp cheekbones, gray eyes that cataloged everything in a single sweep, and the expression of someone who was accustomed to people jumping when she spoke and was currently recalibrating for a world where nobody knew the choreography. "Can I help you?" She crossed to the bench. He indicated her gait uneven, favoring the left foot, the one with the damaged heel. City shoes, Ethan thought, probably cost more than his truck and about as practical for walking on gravel roads as ice skates on asphalt. "My car broke down about a mile back. I got through to roadside assistance, but they're 3 hours out. I didn't want to wait alone on the shoulder." She paused as if the admission of not wanting something had cost her more than the shoes. "Could I sit here until they come?" "Sure, I'll make coffee." He set down his chisel and wiped his hands on his work shirt, dislodging a small avalanche of sawdust. "I'm Ethan, by the way, Ethan Calloway." "Serena." A hesitation so brief it was almost imaginary. "Serena Whitfield." She said the name the way someone might lay down a business card with the expectation that it would be recognized, that it would shift the dynamic, that the other person would suddenly understand who they were dealing with and adjust accordingly. Ethan just nodded and went to make coffee. The name meant nothing to him. Out here in Havenbrook, the names that mattered were Patterson, Calloway, Hendricks, Miller families who'd been rooted in this valley for generations, their identities built on what they could do with their hands rather than what their bank accounts could do for them. Serena sat on the bench, her feet throbbing, her professional identity stripped away by 20 minutes of walking on unpaved road, and looked around. The workshop was actually charming in a way she'd never appreciated before because she'd never been exposed to it. Everything in her world was polished, curated, designed to project an image. This place was the opposite. It was real. The sawdust on the floor, the tools hanging on pegboard walls with the precision of a surgeon's instruments, the half-finished bookcase on the workbench that smelled of fresh-cut oak. All of it spoke of a life organized around creation rather than acquisition. Ethan returned with 2 mugs. Up close, she could see he was probably mid-30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and green eyes that held the steady calm of someone who'd figured out what mattered and stopped chasing everything else. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms that bore the scars and calluses of real work. He moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own body, in his own space, in his own life. It was deeply irritatingly attractive in a way that had nothing to do with conventional handsomeness, and everything to do with a quality Serena couldn't name because she'd so rarely encountered it: authenticity. So he settled onto the other end of the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. What brings Serena Whitfield to Havenbrook besides a mechanical failure? Bad decisions and worse luck. She sipped the coffee and was surprised to find it excellent, rich, dark, with a complexity that put her Manhattan espresso to shame. The cup was ceramic, heavy, handmade if she wasn't mistaken. Even his coffee mugs were crafted rather than purchased. Who was this man? Must be some city if you ended up here instead. Manhattan. Ethan whistled low. Yeah, this is about as far from Manhattan as you can get without leaving New York. They sat in silence for a moment. It should have been awkward, 2 strangers from different universes sharing a bench and a beverage with nothing in common except geographic proximity. But somehow it wasn't. The October sun was warm on her face, the trees rustled with a sound like gentle applause, and for the first time in weeks, Serena's shoulders descended from their position near her ears. Then a small tornado exploded from the workshop. She was maybe 3.5 feet tall, with wild dark curls that had clearly never met a brush they couldn't defeat, and Ethan Calloway's green eyes looking out from a face smudged with paint. She wore overalls 2 sizes too big, the cuffs rolled up to reveal sneakers that had once been white, and she carried a wooden horse that she'd been decorating with spots of blue and purple paint, transforming it from a standard equine into something mythological. She spotted Serena and stopped, dead eyes going wide with the unself-conscious wonder that only children and the very brave can summon on demand. "Who are you? Are you a princess? You look like a princess." "Sophie," Ethan's voice held equal parts warning and apology. "Remember what we said about personal questions?" "It's fine." Serena found herself smiling at the child's unfiltered honesty, and the smile felt strange on her face, like a door opening in a wall she'd forgotten contained one. "I'm Serena. And no, not a princess, just someone whose car broke down." "That's sad." Sophie climbed onto the bench between them, completely uninvited, with the territorial confidence of a 6-year-old who'd never been taught that personal space was a concept. "Do you want to see my horse? His name is Thunder because he runs really fast and makes loud noises." "Sophie," Ethan began, "I'd love to see Thunder." For the next 20 minutes, Serena received a comprehensive education in wooden horse mythology that would have put any university lecture to shame. Sophie Calloway was a force of nature, chattering without pause, showing off Thunder's various spots, each one apparently representing a different magical power, asking questions at a velocity that left Serena breathless. Did Serena have a horse? Did Serena like purple? Did Serena know that butterflies tasted with their feet? Had Serena ever built anything? Did Serena want to try painting? Why was Serena's suit so gray? Didn't she know gray was the most boring color? Except for clouds, which were gray, and also sometimes really cool shapes. Like yesterday, there was one that looked exactly like a dragon eating a taco. And through it all, Ethan watched his daughter with an affection so open, so unguarded, that Serena felt something shift deep inside her chest. Not crack, not break. Shifted the way tectonic plates move slowly and with consequences that take time to fully manifest. This was what family looked like. Not board meetings and ultimatums and strategic marriages designed to optimize shareholder value. Just a father and his daughter in a sunlit yard sharing something real. The simplest thing in the world, and the one thing all of Serena's billions couldn't buy. "Sophie, go wash up for lunch. You've got paint everywhere." "Can Serena stay for lunch? Please, we never have fancy company." "I'm sure Serena has somewhere to be." "Actually," Serena heard herself say, and the words surprised her as much as it surprised Ethan, "I'd love to stay, if that's all right." Ethan studied her for a moment, those green eyes reading something in her face that she probably should have hidden better. Then he nodded. "Sure, fair warning though, lunch is probably just sandwiches." "Sandwiches sound perfect." Sophie grabbed Serena's hand and pulled her toward the stairs with a strength that belied her size, and Serena let herself be pulled, and the October sun painted everything gold. The apartment above the workshop was small and cluttered in a way that made Serena's minimalist penthouse feel like a mausoleum by comparison. Toys scattered across the floor in archipelagos of imagination, a stuffed bear presiding over a kingdom of building blocks. A fleet of paper airplanes crashed on the kitchen counter, a half-completed puzzle of a whale occupying most of the coffee table. Artwork covered the walls, taped up with the confident curation of a child who believed everything she created deserved exhibition. Dishes filled the sink. A basket of laundry sat on the couch, half-folded, abandoned mid-task. "Sorry about the mess." Ethan cleared papers off the kitchen table with the practiced speed of someone who apologized for this regularly but never quite got around to preventing it. "We weren't exactly expecting company." "It's fine, really." And it was. That was the bewildering part. Serena Whitfield, who organized her closet by color and season, who employed a housekeeper specifically to ensure that no surface in her penthouse ever accumulated a molecule of dust, who experienced genuine anxiety when a painting hung even slightly off-center, that Serena should have been deeply uncomfortable in this chaos. Instead, she felt something she couldn't immediately identify. It took her until halfway through lunch to name it welcome. The apartment didn't feel messy. It felt lived in. It felt like a place where people actually existed rather than performed. Over sandwiches that were, as promised, simple but good turkey and Swiss on bread that Ethan admitted he baked himself every Sunday, Serena learned the basics of Ethan Calloway's life. 15 years as a carpenter specializing in custom furniture and restoration. His wife Rachel had died 3 years ago. Cancer, 8 months from diagnosis to funeral. 8 months of watching the person you loved most dissolve like a photograph left in the rain. He didn't say it that way, of course. He said it in the clipped, factual sentences of a man who'd learned to discuss the worst thing that had ever happened to him without letting the words reopen the wound. But Serena was fluent in emotional encryption. She'd been encoding her own feelings since childhood, and she could read between his lines with painful clarity. He was raising Sophie alone. The business was struggling. He didn't say that directly either, but Serena could see it, the careful portion sizes, the generic brand, everything in the kitchen, the way he'd glanced at the utility bill on the counter and then casually flipped it face down. Money was tight, very tight. "What about you?" Ethan asked, and Sophie immediately leaned forward with the intensity of a talk show host sensing a good story. "What do you do in Manhattan?" "I run a company, or I did. It's complicated." "Daddy runs a company too," Sophie announced with the fierce pride of someone who believed her father's operation was on par with anything Manhattan could produce. "Callaway Woodcraft. We make the best toys in the whole world." "I can see that." Serena gestured to Thunder, who'd been given a place of honor at the center of the table. "You're very talented. Daddy made it. He makes everything. He's magic." Ethan's ears turned red. "It's just woodworking, sweetheart." But Serena had spent her career evaluating craftsmanship, and what she'd seen in the yard and the workshop wasn't just woodworking. Every joint was precise, every curve intentional, every surface finished with a care that spoke of someone who understood that the difference between good and exceptional lived in the details most people would never notice. This was mastery. "Can I ask you something?" The question left her mouth before her internal censor could intercept it. "How do you do it? Run a business, raise a child alone, and still seem happy?" Ethan exchanged a glance with Sophie that contained an entire conversation compressed into half a second. "We're a team. We look out for each other. That's enough." That's enough. Serena thought about her penthouse with its 16 rooms and zero warmth, her closet full of armor she wore to impress people she didn't like, her calendar crammed with obligations and empty of anything she actually wanted to do. When was the last time anything had been enough? Before she could follow that thought into darker territory, Sophie tugged her sleeve. "Serena, do you know how to braid hair? Daddy tries, but he's really bad at it." "Hey," Ethan protested, but he was smiling. "I can try." She'd never braided anyone's hair in her life. She'd never had anyone to practice on, no sisters, no close friends, no mother, past age 8. But Sophie was already gathering supplies with the organizational efficiency of a battlefield commander, a brush rubber bands and clips shaped like butterflies. And for the next 30 minutes, Serena Whitfield, CEO of an $8 billion corporation, the Ice Queen of Manhattan, the woman who could negotiate a hostile takeover without breaking a sweat, sat on the floor of a carpenter's apartment and tried to figure out how 3 sections of hair were supposed to interweave without turning into a bird's nest. Ethan coached from the sidelines, clearly amused, occasionally reaching over to untangle a particularly creative mistake. Sophie provided running commentary on the quality of the work with the brutal honesty only a 6-year-old could deliver. "That part's bumpy. You're pulling too tight. Wait, that's actually pretty good. No, never mind, that part's weird again." When Sophie finally jumped up to check the mirror, her squeal of delight was so pure, so uncomplicated by agenda or performance that Serena's throat tightened. "It's perfect. I look like Elsa. Can you come back and do it again? Please." Before Serena could formulate a response, Ethan's phone rang. He checked the screen and something shifted in his face. A door closing, a wall going up. "I need to take this. It's the hospital." He stepped into the other room. Through the wall, Serena could hear his voice drop into the register menus when they're trying to contain something that doesn't want to be contained. Fear. Sophie continued chattering, oblivious, showing Serena her room and her collection of painted rocks and the spot on her wall where she was tracking her height with pencil marks. But Serena's attention was split, one ear tuned to the child's bright monologue and the other tracking the muffled urgency of a father receiving news no father should have to hear. When Ethan came back 5 minutes later, his face was pale. Not white pale. The distinction mattered. White was shock. Pale was the color of someone who'd been expecting bad news and had just learned it was worse than they'd prepared for. "Sophie, go play in your room for a bit, okay?" His voice was gentle, controlled, and absolutely terrifying in its calmness. Just for a few minutes. Something in his tone made Sophie obey, Without argument, a rarity Serena suspected. When the bedroom door closed, Ethan slumped into a kitchen chair and dragged his hands through his hair. Everything okay? Not really. He looked at her, and she saw what he'd been hiding behind the easy confidence and the gentle humor and the good coffee terror. The bone-deep, soul-crushing terror of a parent who can see the cliff edge approaching and can't find the brakes. Sophie has a heart condition, congenital defect ventricular septal. She needs surgery, but the insurance won't cover it. Classified it as a pre-existing condition under our plan. The hospital just moved up the timeline. They want to operate in 4 months instead of next year. Her condition's progressing faster than they expected. How much? The surgery about 300,000. His laugh was the sound of something breaking. Might as well be 3 million. I've been saving everything I can, but he shook his head. I own this building outright. It's not worth much. I've got maybe 40,000 in savings. I've picked up every job I can find, bid on every contract, worked 14-hour days for the past year. I'm not even close. They sat in silence. From Sophie's room came the sound of her humming some melody from a cartoon, probably light and happy, and completely unaware that her future hung in a balance measured in dollars her father didn't have. Ethan stared at his hands on the table, the scarred, calloused hands of a man who'd spent his life building things, and for the first time since Serena had met him, which was, she realized barely 3 hours ago, he looked defeated. Not broken, defeated. There was a difference. Broken men gave up. Defeated men kept fighting, even though they could see the loss coming. Serena's mind, which had spent 3 decades being trained to identify opportunities and calculate risk, began working a problem that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or market share. $300,000. To Ethan Calloway, it was an impossible mountain. To Serena Whitfield, it was less than she'd spent on a painting last year, a painting she hadn't particularly liked, but had purchased because a gallery owner convinced her it was a sound investment. She'd hung it in her penthouse foyer where it gathered dust and admiration in equal measure, and she hadn't looked at it once since the day it was installed. $300,000. The price of a child's life. The price of a painting she didn't care about. The mathematics were obscene. And then before she could think herself out of it, before the cautious corporate strategist in her could erect the usual barriers of risk assessment and due diligence, and what will the board think, Serena Whitfield made the most reckless decision of her life. What if I could help? Ethan looked up sharply. What if I paid for Sophie's surgery, covered all the costs, everything? Serena. He shook his head as if trying to physically dislodge the words. I can't accept charity, especially not from someone I met 3 hours ago. It's not charity. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her voice stayed steady, because if there was one thing Serena Whitfield knew how to do, it was pitch. This would be a business arrangement. You need money for your daughter's surgery. She took a breath. I need a husband. The words hung between them like something fragile balanced on a razor's edge, capable of falling in any direction, each direction leading to a completely different future. I'm sorry, I need to be married within 3 months or I lose my company. You need $300,000 to save your daughter's life. So here's my proposal. We get married. A contract marriage. 1 year. You play the role of my husband for public appearances, family events, whatever's necessary. In exchange, I pay for Sophie's surgery, clear any debts you have, and provide a monthly stipend for living expenses. Ethan stood up and paced to the window. The October light painted him in gold and shadow, and Serena watched the muscles in his jaw work as he processed what she'd said. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured the voice of a man walking through a minefield. You want to pay me to marry you. I want to hire you for a role. Think of it as a year-long acting job with excellent benefits. This is insane. Yes, it is, but is it more insane than letting your daughter's surgery get delayed because you can't afford it? Than watching her get sicker while you exhaust yourself trying to scrape together money that might not come in time? The words landed between them like stones dropped into still water, and Serena knew they were a low blow, and Ethan knew she knew, and neither of them pretended otherwise. That was the thing about desperate people, they recognized each other, not through any external marker, but through something deeper. a frequency of need that vibrated at the same pitch audible only to those currently drowning. Ethan turned from the window. I have conditions. Of course. First, Sophie's well-being comes before everything. Any appearance, any event, any obligation that conflicts with what's best for her, we don't do it. Non-negotiable. Agreed. Second, no lies about our relationship to the press. We're married. We're making it work. But we don't manufacture some fake love story. I won't read scripted lines about falling in love at first sight. That's actually better. The press loves an unconventional couple. The quiet carpenter and the CEO. It writes itself. Third, after the year is up, we go our separate ways, cleanly. No drama. Of course. Fourth, he paused and Serena saw something harden in his expression, not hostility, but the steel of a man drawing a line he wouldn't allow to be crossed. I want everything in writing, every term, every obligation, every financial arrangement. And not your lawyer, a neutral third party, someone who represents both our interests, not just yours. Serena looked at him, this carpenter from a small town in the Catskills, who just negotiated terms with the precision of a corporate attorney and felt something she hadn't expected: respect. He wasn't intimidated by her money. He wasn't dazzled by the numbers or the name. He was protecting his daughter with the only tools he had: intelligence and integrity, and he wasn't going to let the disparity in their bank accounts reduce him to a passive participant in his own story. Her smile was genuine. You're smarter than you look. I'm a small-town carpenter, not an idiot. But his tone was light, the first crack in the tension since she'd made her offer. And the stipend, $3,000 a month, not 5. 3 is fair for my time. Anything more feels like you're buying me. Serena wanted to argue. 5,000 was nothing to her and would make his life substantially easier. But the set of his jaw told her this was another line, another boundary erected by a man whose self-respect was the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. If she pushed, she'd lose him. Not because he'd storm out, but because something essential in the dynamic between them would shift from partnership to transaction, and they'd never get it back. Fine, 3,000. He extended his hand across the table. His palm was warm and rough with calluses when it closed around hers, and Serena was struck by the strange intimacy of the gesture, two people shaking on a deal that would legally bind their lives for a year, decided over cold coffee in a kitchen cluttered with a child's paintings. When do you want to do this? As soon as possible. I'll need to introduce you to my father and the board within the month. The wedding itself can be small. We'll say we wanted something intimate. Sophie's going to want a real wedding. Flowers and cake and a princess dress. Serena hadn't considered that. In her world, weddings were orchestrated performances with guest lists determined by strategic value. But Sophie would see it through 6-year-old eyes, magic and fairy tales, and a day when her father married a woman who braided her hair. Then we'll give her one, within reason. Ethan's smile transformed his entire face, opening it up like a window thrown wide on a spring morning, and Serena felt something dangerous flutter in the vicinity of her sternum. You're going to be terrible at the within reason part, aren't you? Probably. That night, Serena lay on Ethan Calloway's couch under a quilt that smelled like lavender and sawdust and stared at a ceiling she'd never seen before. Through the bedroom wall, she could hear him checking on Sophie, the quiet footsteps, the creak of old floorboards, the gentle murmur of a bedtime routine perfected through 3 years of solo parenting. These were sounds she had no reference for. Her own bedtimes as a child had been punctuated by the click of a closing door and the silence of a father who expressed love through provision rather than presence. In the bedroom, Ethan sat on the edge of Sophie's bed and watched his daughter sleep. Her chest rose and fell with a rhythm that was slightly too fast, slightly too irregular, the signature of a heart that wasn't quite working the way it should. 2 weeks until her next cardiology appointment, and he already knew what the doctor would say. Worse. Getting worse. The timeline was moving up because Sophie's body was running out of patience. He thought about Rachel. What she would say if she could see him now sitting in the dark, contemplating a marriage of convenience with a billionaire heiress he'd known for less than a day. She'd laugh. She would absolutely laugh, that big full-body laugh that had been the first thing he'd loved about her, and then she'd get serious and tell him what she always told him when the path forward was terrifying but necessary. You do whatever it takes to protect our girl Ethan. Whatever it takes. He'd promised Rachel two things before she died. First, that he'd take care of Sophie with everything he had. Second, and this was the one that kept him up at night, the promise that haunted him in the quiet hours when the sawdust settled and the workshop went silent. She'd made him swear he wouldn't turn his grief into a prison. "Don't close off," she'd whispered, her hands so thin he could see the bones beneath the skin. "Don't make my death the end of your story. Promise me." He'd promised. And for 3 years, he'd broken that promise every single day. Not dramatically, he hadn't become a recluse or an alcoholic or any of the obvious failures of grief. He got up every morning, made Sophie breakfast, opened the workshop, did his work, cooked dinner, read bedtime stories, went to sleep. But somewhere inside him, in the place where Rachel used to live, he'd built a wall so thick and so high that nothing could get in. Not friendship, not joy, not the possibility that life might contain something other than duty and sawdust and the mechanical repetition of survival. 1 year. 1 year of pretending, of performing, of playing a role in a world he didn't understand for a woman he'd just met in exchange for the one thing he couldn't provide on his own: Sophie's life, Sophie's future. He already knew his answer. He'd known it the moment Serena said the number. $300,000 was an abstraction. Sophie sleeping peacefully, her repaired heart beating strong and steady, growing up to argue about chocolate chips for breakfast for decades to come, that was real. That was everything. Morning came too quickly and not quickly enough. Serena woke to the smell of fresh coffee and something baking, completely disoriented until the details reassembled Ethan Calloway's couch. Havenbrook, a proposal that seemed even more certifiably insane in the clear, honest light of an October dawn. She sat up wincing as her back lodged a formal complaint about the sleeping arrangements and heard voices from the kitchen. "But why can't I have chocolate chips for breakfast?" "Because chocolate chips aren't breakfast food, sweetheart." "But you put them in pancakes." "That's different. That's basically the same thing, Daddy." Serena found herself smiling despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. She folded the quilt carefully, smoothed her hopelessly wrinkled suit, and walked into the kitchen. Ethan looked up from the stove, spatula in hand, and their eyes met. In that single glance, wordless and weighted, she knew his answer. "Morning, coffee's fresh, pancakes are almost ready." Sophie bounced over yesterday's braid, now a wild, beautiful disaster. "Serena, are you staying forever? Daddy said you might stay for a while." "Sophie, eat your breakfast," Ethan said quickly. They ate. Sophie dominated the conversation with stories about her friend Maya, the upcoming fall festival, and a theory about pumpkins and carriages that blended empirical observation with pure fantasy in roughly equal measure. Serena found herself drawn into the easy rhythm of their morning, a rhythm that had been refined through repetition into something almost musical, each person knowing their part, their timing, their place in the arrangement. When Sophie ran off to brush her teeth, Ethan refilled their coffees and sat across from Serena. "I thought about your offer all night. I have more questions." "I'd be disappointed if you didn't." "Why me, truly? You could marry someone from your world. Someone who already knows the rules." "Because everyone in my world comes with agendas. They'd see this marriage as leverage. You need what I'm offering: money for Sophie's surgery. That's clean, simple, no hidden motives. Except I'd be lying to my daughter. Not lying, not telling her every detail. She's 6. She'll understand that Daddy got married, and that's true. The timeline and the contract are adult complexities she doesn't need. She'll get attached to you." "Maybe." "Not maybe. Definitely. She already asked if you were staying forever, and she's known you less than a day." Serena held his gaze and spoke the hardest truth she had. "She'll also have a healthy heart and a secure future. I'm not pretending this is perfect, but is it worse than the alternative?" Ethan was quiet for a long time. "Then what about your family? Your father, he's just going to accept that you married a small-town carpenter." Her smile was a weapon she'd spent years sharpening. "My father wants me married to prove I'm stable. He didn't specify pedigree, and honestly, he'll probably hate it, which is a bonus." "You don't get along with your father." "That's putting it mildly." She glanced towards Sophie's room. "He sees people as assets or liabilities, nothing in between. I spent my whole life trying to be the perfect asset, and it was never enough." Ethan studied her, and she felt uncomfortably seen, not evaluated, not assessed, but actually perceived the way you perceive a landscape when you stop trying to map it and just look. This marriage isn't just about saving your company, is it? It's about proving something to him. Maybe. She didn't like how easily he read her. In Manhattan, her poker face was legendary. In Havenbrook, apparently it was transparent. Does that change your answer? No, because I'm not doing this for your family drama. I'm doing this for Sophie. He extended his hand again, and when she took it, the handshake felt different from last night's, less tentative, more deliberate. Two people who'd moved past the initial shock and were now engaging with the reality of what they'd set in motion. Within hours, Patricia Brennan arrived from Manhattan with a briefcase and barely concealed shock. Patricia had served the Whitfield family for 20 years, navigating their legal landscape with the precision of a cartographer mapping a war zone, and nothing surprised her anymore. Except apparently this. Let me make sure I understand. You want to marry a carpenter you met yesterday. Day before yesterday, technically. Serena, your father is going to lose his mind. My father gave me 3 months to find a husband. I found one. The terms of his ultimatum didn't specify net worth or social standing. Patricia removed her glasses and pinched the bridge of her nose. You're doing this to spite him, aren't you? I'm doing this to save my company and help a child who needs medical care. If it annoys my father, that's just an excellent side benefit. Patricia spent the next 2 hours drafting contract terms at Ethan's kitchen table with the precision of a surgeon. Financial arrangements, public appearance, obligations, considerations regarding Sophie divorce terms, confidentiality clauses. By the time Ethan came up from the workshop for lunch, they had a 20-page document that reduced a marriage to its transactional components with clinical thoroughness. Ethan read every page, asked questions that proved he understood exactly what he was signing. When he reached the financial section, his hand tightened on the paper, but his voice stayed steady. 3,000 a month, not 5. We agreed. We did, Serena confirmed, and Patricia made the notation without comment, though her eyebrows communicated a detailed editorial. They signed. And just like that, Serena Whitfield had hired herself a husband, and Ethan Calloway had sold a year of his life for his daughter's future. The magnitude of it should have been overwhelming, but instead there was just a kitchen and coffee and the sound of Sophie humming in the next room and the particular silence that follows a decision so large that language hasn't caught up to it yet. Serena sent a single text to her father. Found someone. You'll meet him Friday. Friday arrived with the weight of an execution date. Ethan drove to Manhattan in his truck, a 15-year-old Ford that had survived more Catskill winters than most marriages with Sophie, buckled in the back, singing along to a Disney soundtrack at a volume that suggested she believed the movie's characters could hear her if she sang loudly enough. Serena had offered to send a car service. Ethan had refused. He was already compromising enough of himself for this arrangement. He wasn't going to arrive at his first meeting with a billionaire in a borrowed limousine pretending to be something he wasn't. Whitfield Tower rose 60 stories into the Manhattan skyline, all glass and steel and corporate ambition made architectural. Serena watched through the lobby windows as Ethan's truck pulled up to the valet, absurdly out of place among the luxury vehicles like a work boot at a ballet. The valet stared. The doorman stared. A woman in a fur coat stopped mid-conversation to stare. Ethan climbed out, lifted Sophie down, and straightened the tie he'd bought that morning, his one concession to the occasion, with the calm of a man who'd decided that being himself was the only strategy he was willing to employ. Sophie's eyes went dinner plate wide as they entered the lobby. Wow, is this where you work? It's like a castle. Sort of. Serena had changed into her armor, Saint Laurent charcoal suit heels that added 3 inches to her height hair, in a severe twist that said, "Don't test me." Next to Ethan in his department store suit and Sophie in her flower print dress, she looked like she belonged to a different species, which in a way she did. You look different, Ethan said quietly as they crossed the marble floor. This is my work persona. It's very sharp. That's the point. The elevator ride took 45 seconds and felt like 45 years. Sophie pressed her nose to the glass wall, watching the city shrink below. Ethan stood very still beside Serena, and she could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a furnace. You okay? She murmured. I'm about to meet a billionaire who thinks I'm marrying his daughter for love. So no, not really. Just be yourself. He'll hate that, but he hates everything. Very reassuring. The doors opened into the executive suite. Richard Whitfield's office occupied the entire top floor, a cathedral of corporate power, with views of Manhattan stretching to the horizon in every direction. He stood behind his massive mahogany desk, silver-haired and steel-eyed, and his face cycled through expressions like a slot machine, landing on the worst possible combination: surprise, confusion, cold fury. Serena, you said you were bringing your fiancé, not a... His gaze traveled over Ethan's off-the-rack suit and working hands before landing on Sophie. And a child. Father, this is Ethan Calloway, my fiancé, and his daughter Sophie. Serena's voice could have flash-frozen lava. Ethan, this is my father, Richard Whitfield. Ethan extended his hand with the straightforward confidence of someone who'd never had a reason to be ashamed of his handshake. Mr. Whitfield, nice to meet you. Richard stared at the offered hand the way one might regard an unexpected insect on a dinner plate. But decades of social conditioning prevailed. He shook, briefly, then released as though the contact might be contagious. Calloway, what do you do, Mr. Calloway? I'm a carpenter. I own a woodworking business in Havenbrook. The temperature in the room plummeted. Richard looked at Serena with an expression that combined disbelief, betrayal, and a fury so controlled it was almost more frightening than rage. A carpenter. My daughter, the CEO of a multinational corporation, is marrying a carpenter. Before Ethan could respond, before Richard could escalate, before Serena could deploy whatever cutting remarks she'd been loading, Sophie Calloway, 6 years old, 3 feet tall, utterly unimpressed by corner offices and corporate hierarchies, stepped forward and tilted her head up at Richard Whitfield with the fearless curiosity of someone who hadn't yet learned that some people were supposed to be intimidating. Are you really Serena's daddy? Because you seem kind of mean. She paused, conducting a thorough visual assessment. You haven't smiled once, and you're looking at Serena like she did something bad. She didn't do anything bad. She's really nice. She braided my hair. The office went absolutely silent, the kind of silence that follows a detonation when the air itself seems to be holding its breath, waiting to see what the shrapnel pattern will look like. Ethan looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him. Serena bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste copper. And Richard Whitfield, chairman of an $8 billion empire, stared down at the 6-year-old who just called him mean to his face and experienced, possibly for the first time in decades, the sensation of being completely outmaneuvered by someone who still believed in the tooth fairy. Richard sent Ethan and Sophie to the conference room. Cookies were mentioned, which Sophie considered an acceptable peace offering, and the moment the door closed, the mask dropped. What the hell are you thinking, a carpenter? A carpenter with a child. This is career suicide. This is survival. You backed me into a corner, so I found a way out. You don't get to complain about the solution when you created the problem. They went back and forth, Richard attacking Serena, pairing in the rhythm of two people who'd been arguing for decades and knew each other's vulnerabilities, the way demolition experts know load-bearing walls. Richard called it reckless. Serena called it pragmatic. Richard said the board would revolt. Serena said the board would do what Richard told them because he still controlled 40% of the voting shares. Richard threatened to withdraw support. Serena threatened to resign, marry Ethan anyway, and start a competing company with the contacts and capital and industry knowledge to make his life professionally miserable. It was a bluff, mostly, but Richard didn't need to know that. Then he said something that stopped the argument cold. He'd been pacing near the window, hands clasped behind his back, and he turned to face her, and his expression shifted from fury to something older, raw, something she'd never seen on his face before. You look at him the way your mother used to look at me, before I destroyed that too. 32 years. In 32 years, Richard Whitfield had never once acknowledged that his relentless ambition had cost him the only person who genuinely loved him. He'd never mentioned destroying his marriage to Eleanor, never admitted that the empire he'd built was constructed on the ruins of something infinitely more valuable. And now, standing in his monument to corporate achievement, staring at his daughter, who was about to marry a man with sawdust under his fingernails, he'd cracked the door to a room he'd kept locked since the day Eleanor died. Serena felt the ground shift beneath her. I'm not you, and Ethan isn't Mom. No, but the look is the same. He turned back to the window. When's the wedding? 3 weeks. small ceremony, immediate family. The board will want to meet him first. Arrange it. And Serena. He paused, and for one fraction of a second, she thought he might say something human, something that acknowledged the impossibility of what she was doing and the courage it required. Instead, make it quick. We have a lot to plan. He walked out because that's what Richard Whitfield did. He declared and he departed, and he left other people to deal with the emotional aftermath of his proclamations. Serena stood alone in his office, surrounded by the monuments of his success, and pressed her fingers to her mother's pearl earrings, the only thing of Eleanor's she still possessed, and felt them cool against her skin like a touch from the other side of absence. In the conference room, she found Ethan and Sophie at the massive table, Sophie methodically working through a plate of cookies with the focused determination of someone conducting important research. Ethan nursed coffee and wore the expression of a man who'd survived a natural disaster and was still assessing the damage. How bad? About what I expected. He's furious, but he'll fall in line. He hates me. He hates everyone. Don't take it personally. Sophie looked up, chocolate on her chin. These cookies are really good, Serena. Way better than the ones at home. Can we bring some back? And despite everything, the ultimatum, the contract, the fury, the fear, Ethan and Serena looked at each other over Sophie's head and smiled the same smile, the involuntary kind that happens when something genuine breaks through the layers of performance and pretense and reaches the place where human beings actually live. Sure, we'll bring some back. The drive home was quiet in the way that only shared exhaustion can produce. Sophie crashed in the back seat within minutes, her body surrendering to the accumulated excitement and sugar with the instantaneous totality that only children can achieve. Ethan drove with his eyes on the road and his thoughts clearly somewhere else, probably recalibrating his understanding of the world he'd just agreed to enter. Serena watched the landscape change through the passenger window. Manhattan's Steel Canyon giving way to suburban sprawl, then to the open green and gold of the Catskills. The transition so gradual it was almost imperceptible until you suddenly realized you were breathing differently. Deeper, slower, the way people breathe when the air isn't competing with 8 million other pairs of lungs. Thank you, she said finally, for what you said to my father, for standing your ground. I didn't do it for you, I did it because he was out of line. Still, most people are terrified of him. Ethan glanced at her, then back at the road. I'm scared of lots of things. Angry billionaires just don't make the list. She almost smiled, almost. You really think he'll accept this? He doesn't have a choice, and deep down he knows you'd follow through on the threat. Would you start a competing company? Serena considered the question honestly. I don't know, but the important thing is that he believes I would. They drove on. The sky deepened toward evening, painting the Catskill ridges in shades of purple and amber that no Manhattan sunset could compete with. In the back seat, Sophie shifted in her sleep, murmuring something that might have been thunder or might have been cookies. Either seemed equally plausible. Sophie defended you today, Ethan said, his voice different now, softer, more careful. In front of your father. She doesn't do that for just anyone. She's known you less than 2 days and he paused. She's already attached. Is that a problem? I don't know yet. His fingers drummed the steering wheel, the only visible indicator of whatever storm was moving through his internal landscape. When this is over, when the year is up, she's going to tell me hurt. She's 6. She won't understand why you're leaving. We'll explain it carefully. Make sure she knows it's not her fault. Kids don't work like that. You can't logic away their feelings. The truth of it settled between them like a third passenger, silent, heavy, taking up space neither of them could spare. They were making a choice that would help Sophie now, but potentially wound her later, and there was no mathematical formula, no contract clause, no amount of careful planning that could resolve that paradox. They could only do what they could do and hope it was enough. The truck crested the final hill before Havenbrook, and the valley opened below them. Scattered lights in the gathering dark wood smoke rising from chimneys, the particular beauty of a place that didn't know it was beautiful, because it had never tried to be anything other than itself. Serena looked at it and felt something she didn't want to name, because naming it would make it real, and real things could be lost. Ethan carried a sleeping Sophie upstairs while Serena gathered her things. She needed to get back to Manhattan, back to the machinery of merging 2 lives on paper, while keeping them separate in reality. But she paused at the door, looking back at the workshop in the fading light, the weathered wood, the hand-painted sign, the yard full of furniture that someone had poured their heart into, piece by careful piece, and thought about her penthouse waiting in the city. 16 rooms, 14 of them empty. Serena, Ethan's voice from Sophie's bedroom doorway low enough not to wake her. Before you go to the wedding, Sophie's going to have expectations. Flowers and cake and a princess dress. The whole fairy tale. Then we'll give her that. Can you? He leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, studying her. Can you do a wedding that isn't about business strategy and guest lists? Can you let it just be nice? She thought about the weddings she'd attended, cold strategic affairs designed to merge families and fortunes, where the vows were boilerplate and the guest list was a spreadsheet. She thought about her own parents' wedding photos, her mother and father standing side by side looking like strangers who'd been told to smile for a camera they didn't trust. I can try. Good, because if we're doing this, if we're bringing Sophie into this arrangement, then we owe her at least one day where it feels real. He was right. They both knew it. The contract could govern everything else, the finances, the appearances, the scheduled interactions, the clean exit. But the wedding itself that one day had to belong to Sophie. She deserved a day of magic in a life that had already contained too much loss. I'll plan something nice. Small, but nice. Thank you. He walked her to the door. Drive safe. I will. She paused on the threshold. Ethan, what you said to my father about understanding what we're getting into, do you really? He met her eyes steadily. No, I don't think either of us fully understands what we're getting into, but I guess we'll figure it out as we go. It wasn't reassuring exactly, but it was honest, and Serena was starting to realize that honesty in her world was rarer than diamonds and infinitely more valuable. She drove back to Manhattan through the darkness, her headlights cutting white tunnels through country night. Behind her, a contract marriage, a disapproving father, and a 6-year-old who decided to defend her honor to one of the most powerful men in New York. Ahead, a penthouse that would feel emptier than it had that morning, though nothing in it had changed. The Catskills faded in her rear-view mirror. Manhattan's glow rose on the horizon like a false dawn, all that light signifying nothing but the refusal to acknowledge darkness. And somewhere between the two, between the sawdust warmth of Havenbrook and the glass chill of Manhattan, Serena Whitfield realized something that terrified her more than any boardroom ultimatum. She didn't entirely hate how her life had just become something she couldn't control. 3 weeks until the wedding. 3 weeks to prepare for a marriage that was supposed to be simple and transactional and completely under her management. She had no idea, not one single idea, how spectacularly wrong that assumption was about to prove. The wedding took place on the last Saturday of October, when the trees had committed fully to their annual act of arson, and the air carried that particular autumn crispness that made everything feel like it was beginning rather than ending. Serena had kept her promise. Small, but nice. The truth was closer to extraordinary, which terrified her in ways no quarterly earnings report ever had. The estate sat 40 minutes outside the city, a historic property, whose gardens looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd read every fairy tale ever written and decided to build them all simultaneously. White roses and English ivy draped the wooden arbor where vows would be exchanged. Strings of Edison bulbs waited in the trees dormant until evening would bring them to life like earthbound constellations. A string quartet played Debussy on the south lawn, the notes drifting across the grounds with the unhurried elegance of autumn leaves. 32 guests. That was it. On Ethan's side, his brother Tom, who'd driven up from Pennsylvania with the suspicious alertness of a man expecting an ambush. 4 friends from Havenbrook, including old Bill Hendricks, who taught Ethan to sharpen a chisel when he was 12, and Mrs. Patterson from the general store wearing a hat that could have doubled as a small satellite dish. On Serena's side, Richard radiating disapproval like a space heater radiates warmth involuntarily and in all directions. 3 board members who'd made the trip out of obligation rather than affection, and Patricia Brennan, who'd become something approaching a friend during the contract negotiations, largely because she was the only person willing to tell Serena she was insane. And Sophie, of course. Sophie, who had lobbied for the biggest princess dress available in the tri-state area and was currently spinning in the bridal suite watching the tulle skirt float around her like a private weather system. Layers of white over champagne crystals scattered across the bodice that caught every available photon and redirected it into joy. Do I look like Elsa? 15 was the count. Serena had been tracking. You look better than Elsa. Sophie stopped spinning long enough to study Serena's reflection in the full-length mirror with the merciless critical eye that only a 6-year-old or a fashion editor could summon. Serena had chosen a dress that walked the line between bridal and pragmatic ivory silk to her ankles, long sleeves and neckline that whispered rather than shouted. No veil, no train, nothing that demanded the kind of attention she spent her professional life commanding and her personal life avoiding. Her hair was down for the first time Sophie had ever seen it, falling in waves past her shoulders, and her only jewelry was the pearl earrings that had belonged to Eleanor. You look like a queen. Sophie's assessment was delivered with absolute authority. Then her eyes narrowed. You keep touching your earrings. Daddy does that with his watch when he's nervous. Are you scared? Serena forced her hand away from her ear. I'm not scared, just thinking. About what? About how this entire arrangement was designed to be simple and controlled and contractually delineated, and instead she was standing in a bridal suite with a child who looked at her like she could rearrange the stars, about to marry a man she'd known for 3 weeks, and nothing, absolutely nothing, felt simple anymore. About how lucky your dad is to have you. Sophie grinned. I know, I'm the best. Patricia appeared at the door, her expression the practiced neutral of a lawyer who'd seen too much to be surprised but not enough to be numb. It's time. He's already at the arbor. A pause. You ready? Every cell in Serena's body screamed no. Every synapse fired warnings about risk and exposure and the catastrophic potential of voluntary vulnerability. She was walking towards something she couldn't control, couldn't predict, couldn't reduce to a spreadsheet or a contract clause, and every instinct she'd spent 32 years developing told her to run. Ready? The walk to the ceremony was 30 yards of grass and a lifetime of doubt. Sophie went first, scattering rose petals with the wild enthusiasm of someone who believed precision was for people who didn't understand joy, creating patterns that looked less like a petal path and more like a beautiful crime scene. Serena followed her heels, sinking slightly into the soft ground, and kept her eyes on the arbor, because looking anywhere else would mean acknowledging the 32 faces turning to watch her, and she wasn't ready for that particular species of exposure. Then she saw Ethan, and something in the center of her chest went quiet. He'd refused the designer tuxedo. She'd expected that. What she hadn't expected was how good he looked in what he'd chosen instead. A dark suit, well-tailored, that fit his frame the way a glove fits a hand that's done real work. His hair was neatly trimmed, his shoes polished to a shine that suggested Mrs. Patterson's intervention, and when he saw Serena walking toward him, his expression shifted. Not from nervous to confident, from nervous to something altogether more dangerous, something unscripted, something the contract hadn't accounted for. He looked at her the way people look at things they know they should be careful with, but can't quite bring themselves to handle gently. She reached the arbor. He took her hand. His palm was sweating, so was hers. You look incredible. Low enough for only her. You clean up well yourself. Sophie insisted on the cologne. I smell like a department store. You smell fine. The officiant, a warm-voiced woman named Barbara, who performed secular ceremonies and had agreed to the 3-week timeline with the unflappable calm of someone who'd married people under significantly weirder circumstances, cleared her throat. Shall we? The vows were short because they'd written them to be honest without being revealing, to mean something without meaning everything. Serena promised partnership, respect, to care for Ethan and Sophie with everything she had. The words were true. That was the disorienting part. She'd expected to feel like an actress delivering lines, and instead she felt like someone cracking open a vault she'd sealed shut years ago. Ethan's vows were simpler, the way load-bearing beams are simpler than decorative molding, unadorned, but holding everything up. He promised to stand beside her even when it was hard, to be honest even when the truth was uncomfortable. And then, without looking at his note card, without rehearsal or calculation, he added 5 words that weren't in any draft they'd reviewed: to build something real together. The officiant pronounced them married. The instruction to kiss the bride hung in the air like a held breath. They'd discussed this. Brief, professional. A checkbox on the performance checklist. Ethan leaned in, and his lips met hers, and the checklist caught fire. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Enough time for Serena to forget the 32 witnesses, the contract in Patricia's briefcase, the entire elaborate architecture of pretense they'd constructed. Enough time for something to arc between them, not electric, not cinematic, but cellular, as if some part of her body recognized some part of his from a conversation they'd never had. When they separated, Ethan's expression told her he'd felt it too, and neither of them had the slightest idea what to do about it. Sophie resolved the moment by crashing into both of them at knee-level, arms wrapped around their legs with enough force to nearly topple the ceremony. "You're married. You're really married. Does this mean Serena's my mom now?" Ethan and Serena's eyes met over Sophie's head, a shared panic that was also somehow a shared tenderness. "It means Serena is part of our family now. We'll figure out the details as we go." Sophie accepted this with the pragmatism of someone who had bigger priorities. "Come on, Mrs. Patterson said there's cake with 4 layers." The reception unfolded in the garden pavilion as the sun descended and the string lights came alive, transforming the space into something that existed halfway between reality and the kind of dream you don't want to wake from. The long communal table seated all 32 guests together. No head table, no hierarchy, just people sharing food and space in a configuration that felt more like Thanksgiving at a particularly large family's house than a wedding reception. The food was excellent. Ethan had insisted on comfort over cuisine roasted chicken, autumn vegetables glazed with maple fresh bread that filled the pavilion with a particular warmth that only baking can produce. Serena found herself seated between Ethan and Tom, the latter studying her with the undisguised suspicion of an older brother who'd been given no advance warning and very little explanation. "So, you really run a multinational corporation?" "I really do." "And you married my little brother, the carpenter?" "I really did." Tom took a long drink of wine, the deliberate kind that buys time for thoughts to organize themselves. "Ethan said you two met when your car broke down." Ethan leaned over. "Tom, don't interrogate my wife at our reception." "I'm not interrogating. I'm conducting due diligence." Tom's eyes stayed on Serena. "My brother hasn't dated anyone since Rachel died. 3 years. Nothing. And suddenly he shows up married to someone who lives in a different zip code, different tax bracket, different planet. You can understand my curiosity." "I can." Serena set down her fork and met his gaze with the same directness she brought to board meetings and hostile negotiations. "I know this seems sudden and unconventional, but Ethan and I have an understanding. We're both adults making an adult decision that benefits us both." Tom's eyebrows rose a fraction. "Understanding? You're calling your marriage an understanding at your own reception?" "Tom," Ethan's voice carried a warning. "No, I want to hear this." Tom leaned forward. "What exactly is my brother getting out of this understanding?" She could lie. She could deflect the way she deflected 100 questions a week from reporters and analysts and board members who were paid to probe for weakness. But something about Tom's directness, so similar to Ethan's, so clearly genetic, made dishonesty feel not just wrong, but wasteful. Security for Sophie, medical care she needs, a stable future. She held his gaze. "And what I'm getting is someone who sees me as a person instead of a stepping stone to my father's fortune." Tom studied her for what felt like a geological epoch. Then he looked at Ethan, then back at Serena. "You're paying for Sophie's surgery." It wasn't a question. The man was sharp. The whole family apparently traded in perception rather than pretense. "Yes." And that's why Ethan agreed. "That's part of it. Quiet, processing, the kind of silence that happens when someone is reorganizing their entire assessment of a situation based on new data." Then Tom raised his glass. "Well, welcome to the family, Serena. We're a mess, but we're honest about it." They clinked glasses and something tight behind Serena's sternum loosened a quarter turn. Not all the way, but enough. Across the table, Richard Whitfield observed the interaction with the focused stillness of a chess player calculating 7 moves ahead. He'd barely spoken to anyone all evening, choosing instead to watch from behind his wineglass like a predator conserving energy for the hunt he'd already planned. When dinner ended and people began to circulate, he approached Serena with the deliberate precision of someone who never wasted a single step. "We need to talk. We're at my wedding reception. I had him investigated." Richard steered her toward a quieter section of the garden. "Exactly what he appears to be. Widowed 3 years, no criminal record, daughter with a heart condition he can't afford to treat. Clean, almost disappointingly clean. Did you expect a secret criminal empire? I expected an angle. Everyone has one. Maybe Ethan doesn't. Richard's laugh held no amusement. Everyone has an angle, Serena. His is obvious he needs the money. What I can't figure out is yours. I told you I needed to be married. You could have married Douglas Hartley, or James Morrison, or any of a dozen men who would have strengthened the company's position. Instead, you married a nobody from nowhere. The words landed the way her father intended them, precisely with maximum structural damage. But Serena had been absorbing this particular kind of blow since childhood, and her defenses, while damaged, were still operational. Ethan is a skilled craftsman, a devoted father, and a genuinely good human being. Those qualities seem to be in short supply in your circle. My circle is your circle. Is it? Because right now I'm standing in a garden at my wedding, wondering why my father is more interested in undermining my husband than congratulating his daughter. On the air between them compressed. Richard looked at her, really looked, not the evaluative scan of a CEO assessing a subordinate, but the searching gaze of a father confronting something in his daughter he hadn't anticipated and couldn't quite categorize. You care about him. I respect him. That's not what I said. His voice softened to something almost tender, almost human, and it frightened Serena more than his anger ever had. You look at him, Serena, the way your mother used to look at me, before I made that impossible. He walked away before she could respond, leaving her alone among the roses with a truth she hadn't asked for and couldn't return. The first dance announcement pulled her back from the edge. Sinatra floated from the speakers, something about stars and foolish hearts, and Ethan stood at the edge of the dance floor looking like a man facing a firing squad who'd been told to waltz. I forgot about this part. You forgot about the first dance at your own wedding. I was hoping it would spontaneously cancel itself. He extended his hand. Fair warning, this is going to be painful. He was right. Ethan Calloway danced the way a man builds furniture, with earnest effort and complete disregard for anything resembling grace. He counted steps under his breath. He apologized 3 times for nearly stepping on her feet. He held her at a distance that suggested he was trying to maintain the professional boundaries they'd agreed upon, while simultaneously failing to remember where those boundaries were. It was without question the most charming thing Serena had ever experienced. You're doing fine. I'm committing a crime against Sinatra. He won't press charges. They moved together under the lights, and Serena became aware of things the contract hadn't covered. The warmth of Ethan's hand against her back. The smell of him. Not the department store cologne Sophie had insisted on, but underneath it, something truer, sawdust and soap, and the particular scent of someone who worked with his hands and lived in his body rather than performing from behind a desk. The way he was looking at her. Not at the CEO, not at the heiress, not at the carefully constructed public persona she deployed like a weapon. At her. Whatever her was underneath all of it. Serena, his voice had dropped to something private. That kiss earlier, during the ceremony, that was just for the guests, right? Just performance. She should have said yes, should have laughed and rebuilt the walls and reminded both of them that this was theater, well staged and temporary, with a predetermined closing night. But she'd spent her entire life saying the strategic thing, the controlled thing, the thing that maintained maximum advantage while minimizing vulnerability, and for once, just this once, the truth came out before the censor could catch it. I don't know. Ethan's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her waist. Yeah, me neither. The song ended. They stepped apart. And both of them understood with a clarity that required no discussion that they had just walked past a sign that read, "Point of no return," and kept going. The Monday after the wedding, reality returned with the subtlety of a freight train. Serena walked into Whitfield Global to find Daniel Mercer waiting in the conference room with the board, his 73 years sitting on his frame, like a well-made coat, substantial but not heavy. Congratulations on your marriage, Mrs. Calloway. His eyes held the particular sharpness of someone who'd spent 5 decades separating performance from substance and had become quite good at it. Your father speaks very highly of your work. They both knew Richard did nothing of the sort, but Mercer was a man who appreciated the choreography of corporate interaction even when the steps were fictional. The meeting covered merger timelines, integration protocols, the granular mechanics of combining two corporate organisms into one. Serena performed at full capacity. Her mind could still partition itself even when her chest couldn't. But she was aware throughout of Mercer watching her with something beyond professional assessment. He was looking for something. She couldn't tell what. When the room emptied, Mercer lingered. He stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, gazing at the Manhattan skyline, with the expression of someone who'd once found it impressive and now found it merely familiar. "May I offer some personal advice, Mrs. Calloway?" His tone carried none of the condescension that usually accompanied unsolicited wisdom from older men. This was something different, gentler weighted with experience he'd earned rather than inherited. "Of course. I built Mercer Technologies with my late wife, Catherine. We started with $400 in a belief that stubbornness was a business strategy. And I'll tell you what 47 years of marriage taught me." He turned from the window. "The companies we build are only as strong as the foundations we stand on. If the marriage is solid, everything else follows. But if it's hollow, a shrug that contained entire chapters of autobiography. I've seen promising empires crumble because the people at the top forgot what really mattered." The word hollow hit Serena like a stone aimed precisely at glass. "You're wondering why I'm telling you this." Mercer's smile was warm in a way that corporate smiles never were. "The truth is, I like you, Serena. You remind me of my daughter before she let the business consume her. Don't make the same mistake. Protect what you have with that carpenter of yours. Money comes and goes. But finding someone who sees you as more than a balance sheet, that's the rare thing. That's the thing you fight for." He left. Serena sat alone in the conference room, staring at her phone where a text from Ethan waited. "Sophie wants to know if you can come to dinner Thursday. She's making mac and cheese from scratch, apparently." She typed, "I'd love to." "What time?" "6. Fair warning, her cooking skills are ambitious but messy." "I'll bring wine and backup mac and cheese." She could almost feel his laugh through the screen. "Deal." Serena set down the phone and tried to focus on the merger documents in front of her, but her mind kept drifting north toward the Catskills, toward a kitchen table where a 6-year-old was probably already planning a menu that would generate more mess than nutrition, toward a man who'd built her a life she hadn't asked for and didn't deserve and couldn't seem to stop wanting. Thursday came, then the next Thursday, then the one after that. The dinners evolved from obligation into ritual. Sophie's mac and cheese, consistently overcooked, aggressively peppered, and served with a pride that rendered criticism impossible, became the meal Serena looked forward to more than any five-star dinner in Manhattan. They fell into a pattern, cooking together in the small kitchen, Sophie commanding Ethan, executing Serena, attempting to help, and mostly creating additional chaos, eating at the table where the contract had been signed. Nobody mentioned this, then migrating to the couch for whatever animated feature Sophie had selected. The couch arrangement told its own story. First Thursday, Serena on one end, Ethan on the other, Sophie between them. Third Thursday, Sophie sprawled across both their laps, head on Serena's knee, feet tucked under Ethan's arm, her body a bridge connecting two people who were still pretending they needed one. By the fifth Thursday, Serena had stopped pretending she was maintaining professional distance and started admitting to herself, only to herself, that these evenings were the only hours in her week when she felt like a participant in her own life rather than a spectator. The apartment changed around her presence in increments so small they were almost subliminal. First, she forgot a jacket. Then she brought a change of clothes for the next morning in case I stay late. Then a toothbrush appeared in the bathroom holder without anyone acknowledging its arrival or departure. Then the empty drawer in Ethan's dresser, the one that had been Rachel's, the one he hadn't been able to bring himself to fill, quietly accepted a few of Serena's things folded neatly, taking up minimal space, as if even her belongings understood they were guests in someone else's grief. Ethan noticed. He noticed everything. But his response wasn't a conversation, it was a piece of furniture. She arrived one Thursday to find a desk near the living room window. Small, elegant, made from reclaimed maple, with a honey-warm finish that caught the afternoon light. The surface had been hand-planed to a smoothness that invited touch. One side held a shallow drawer, sized precisely for a laptop, the other a deeper compartment for files. The height was perfect for her frame. The position caught the best natural light in the apartment. There was no note, no announcement, no moment of presentation. Just a desk in a place where there hadn't been one before, built by hands that understood both the wood and the woman who would sit there. Serena ran her fingers along the maple surface and felt the hours embedded in it, the measuring, the cutting, the careful joining of pieces that had once been part of a living tree and were now part of her life. She'd owned furniture that cost $50,000. Italian leather Danish design pieces selected by interior decorators whose taste was impeccable and whose invoices were astronomical. None of it had ever made her feel what this desk made her feel, that someone had paid attention. Not to her name, or her net worth, or her corporate title, but to the angle at which she held her neck when she read the way she stacked documents, the particular geometry of how she occupied space. He'd seen her, and he'd built accordingly. She sat down. The desk fit her the way the contract never could. The phone call from Ethan's bank came on a Tuesday in November, and it detonated the fragile architecture of trust they'd been building for weeks. Ethan was in the workshop finishing a bookcase commission when his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end belonged to a loan officer at Havenbrook Savings Professional, slightly uncomfortable, calling to confirm the transfer of loan servicing that had been requested for the Callaway Woodcraft commercial mortgage. Ethan had not requested any transfer of loan servicing. He hadn't spoken to anyone about his mortgage since the last payment, which he'd made on time, despite the financial pressure, because a man's word to a bank was still a man's word, even when the bank didn't deserve the loyalty. It took him 40 minutes and 3 phone calls to trace the request to its source, a subsidiary of Whitfield Global Industries. Richard Whitfield was attempting to purchase Ethan's commercial debt, not to help, not to alleviate, but to own, to hold, to deploy if necessary as leverage. The message was elegant in its brutality. If Ethan ever became inconvenient, if the marriage stopped serving Richard's purposes, if Serena needed to be extracted from this arrangement, Richard would own the mortgage on everything Ethan had built. His workshop, his home, his livelihood, the building where Rachel had painted the nursery for Sophie, the walls that still held the pencil marks tracking his daughter's growth. Ethan called Serena. His voice was level in the way that a frozen lake is level, flat, contained, and concealing enormous pressure beneath the surface. Your father is trying to buy my workshop. No preamble, no softening, just the fact delivered with the precision of a man who'd spent his life cutting joints that fit exactly. Silence on the line. Then what? The bank called. Someone at Whitfield Global requested a transfer of my loan servicing. I traced it. It's your father's people. He's acquiring my debt so he has a lever to pull if this marriage becomes inconvenient. If he wants me gone, he can threaten my building, my business, my home. More silence. When Serena spoke, her voice was stripped of every corporate polish she normally wore like armor. Ethan, I swear I didn't know about this. I believe you. He did. That was the painful part. He believed Serena was exactly who she appeared to be, which made everything worse because the world she came from, the world her father commanded, operated on principles that treated people like chess pieces and buildings like bargaining chips. But this is exactly why I don't belong in your world. In your world, people are either tools or obstacles. And right now, your father is deciding which one I am. Serena drove to Manhattan that night. She didn't call ahead. She walked into Whitfield Tower at 9 p.m., past the startled security guard, up the private elevator, and into her father's office, where Richard was reviewing documents with the focused calm of a man who expected the world to operate on his schedule and was rarely disappointed. What followed was the most savage argument the Whitfield family had produced in 3 decades of savage arguments. Serena didn't raise her voice. She'd learned from her father that volume was the weapon of the weak, but the temperature of her words could have frozen the Hudson solid. She told him she knew about the loan. She told him it was a violation of trust so fundamental that it made his ultimatum about marriage look like a minor social faux pas. She told him that if he ever interfered with Ethan's business, his property, or his life again, she would not merely leave the company. She would leave him. Completely. Permanently. No phone calls, no holidays, no deathbed reconciliations. He would lose his daughter the way he'd lost his wife, through his own inability to distinguish love from control. Richard, to his credit or his discredit, didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He simply looked at his daughter with an expression she'd never seen before. Not anger, not calculation, but something that might have been recognition. The recognition of a man seeing his own worst qualities reflected in the consequences of his actions, and understanding perhaps for the first time that the weapons he'd spent a lifetime sharpening were now being used against the only person he had left. I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself. There's a difference you've never learned. She left. The elevator ride down was silent. The drive back to her penthouse was silent. The penthouse itself was silent, as it always was, 16 rooms of expensive silence that she'd once mistaken for peace and now recognized as its opposite. She didn't call Ethan that night. He didn't call her. The distance between Manhattan and Havenbrook, which she'd been crossing every Thursday with increasing eagerness, suddenly felt like an ocean measured not in miles but in the fundamental incompatibility of two worlds that had been temporarily bridged by a contract and were now threatening to split apart along the fault line her father had exposed. 3 days passed. Thursday arrived. Serena didn't know whether to drive to Havenbrook or stay in Manhattan, didn't know whether Ethan's silence was anger or processing or the quiet withdrawal of a man who'd seen enough evidence to render a verdict. She sat in her penthouse at 4 in the afternoon, keys in her hand, paralyzed by a species of uncertainty she'd never experienced in a boardroom. The uncertainty of caring what another person thought of her. Not because they controlled her career, but because they'd seen past her armor, and what they'd found there was somehow worth protecting. She drove to Havenbrook, not with a speech prepared, not with an apology rehearsed. She drove in jeans the first time Ethan would see her, without corporate armor, and she stopped at Mrs. Patterson's general store and picked up the apple pie that Mrs. Patterson had mentioned baking that morning. Ethan was in the workshop when she arrived. He looked up from his workbench and saw her standing in the doorway holding a pie, wearing denim, looking nothing like the woman who'd walked into his life in Louboutins and a Valentino suit 5 weeks ago, and everything like someone who'd driven 2 hours because she didn't have the words for what she needed to say and hoped the gesture would speak instead. Mrs. Patterson asked me to bring this over. I'm just the delivery service. He looked at the pie. He looked at her. He knew, of course, he knew that Mrs. Patterson lived 400 yards from his workshop and had never once in 70-plus years required a courier service from Manhattan. But he also knew what the pie meant. I'm sorry. Not for what my father did, because that's his sin, not mine. But for the world I come from and the damage it does, and the fact that you're standing in the blast radius because of me. He didn't say any of this. He just opened the door wider and stepped aside, and Serena walked in, and the maple desk by the window caught the last of the afternoon light, and somewhere in the apartment above them, Sophie was singing a song about snowmen, and the distance between their worlds shrank back to something manageable. Not gone, just manageable. December arrived with the subtlety of a hammer. The leaves had surrendered. The Catskills stood bare against steel-gray skies, their beauty now architectural rather than ornamental bones of a landscape stripped of everything decorative, revealing the structure underneath. Serena found it appropriate. She felt similarly stripped. Sophie's surgery was scheduled for the 8th. As the date approached, Ethan underwent a transformation that frightened Serena more than any corporate crisis ever had. The easy confidence evaporated. In its place, a brittle tension that manifested in clenched jaws, compulsive checking in on Sophie throughout the day, and a work ethic that had shifted from dedication to something closer to mania. He barely slept. He barely ate. He threw himself into the workshop with an intensity that produced beautiful furniture and destroyed his body in equal measure. Serena found him there at 11 on a Tuesday night, sanding a rocking chair that had already been sanded 3 times. The chair was Rachel's, or had been, the one she'd sat in during Sophie's infancy, nursing and singing in the hours between midnight and dawn, when the world belongs exclusively to mothers and their children. Ethan had never sold it, never refinished it, never done anything with it except keep it in the corner of the workshop where it gathered sawdust and memory in equal layers. You need to rest. I'm fine. He didn't look up. The sandpaper moved in long, rhythmic strokes, the sound like breathing. You're not fine. You're running on coffee and fear, and neither one has a very long battery life. His hand stopped. The silence that followed was louder than the sanding had been. When he spoke, his voice came from somewhere deep, somewhere below the competence and the confidence and the daily performance of a man holding his life together with carpentry and willpower. What if something goes wrong? The sandpaper fell from his fingers. What if the surgery doesn't work? What if I lose her the way I lost Rachel? His hands were shaking. Ethan Calloway, whose hands had never once trembled, while holding a chisel or a saw, or his daughter, whose hands were the most reliable tools in his possession, was shaking so badly he couldn't hold a sheet of sandpaper. Serena crossed the workshop and took those hands in hers. The calluses pressed against her palms. The tremor transferred from his body to hers like a current, and she absorbed it, held it, refused to let go. The surgeon is one of the best in the country. The success rate for this specific procedure is over 95%. Sophie is strong. Every statistic is in her favor. Statistics didn't save Rachel. The words were raw, torn from a place he'd kept sealed for 3 years, with work and routine and the daily mechanics of single parenthood. She had good numbers too, good prognosis, good doctors, and I sat beside her sped and watched the numbers lie. He collapsed against her, then not dramatically, not with the cinematic grandeur of a movie breakdown, but with the quiet, devastating surrender of a man who'd been carrying a weight beyond his capacity for longer than anyone should have to, and had finally, in the privacy of a sawdust-covered workshop at 11 at night, allowed himself to set it down. She held him. She didn't tell him it would be okay because she'd grown up in a household where promises were weapons and reassurances were lies, and she respected him too much to offer either. She just held him, and he shook, and the rocking chair sat in the corner, bearing witness to a grief that had never really ended, just changed shape. The night before the surgery, Serena stayed at the apartment. She'd had an early meeting she canceled without hesitation, the first meeting she'd ever canceled for anything other than illness. A small revolution that Patricia noted with raised eyebrows and no comment. Sophie was nervous, chattering about everything except the hospital, with the transparent deflection of someone who'd learned that talking fast enough could sometimes outrun fear. "Well, I have a big scar," Ethan's jaw tightened. "A small one, but it'll fade. Like a warrior scar. Exactly like a warrior scar." Sophie seemed satisfied. She finished her chicken nuggets, her requested last meal before the pre-surgery fast, and looked at Serena with those bottomless green eyes. "Will you be there at the hospital? If you want me there, I'll be there. I want you there. You and Daddy both. Then we'll both be there." That night, after Sophie finally surrendered to sleep with thunder clutched to her chest like a wooden talisman, Ethan and Serena sat in the darkened living room and did not speak. There was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying. Tomorrow the child they both loved would be placed under anesthesia and cut open, and everything they'd built, the contract, the arrangement, the careful architecture of professional distance, was irrelevant in the face of the only thing that actually mattered. Ethan reached for Serena's hand. She laced their fingers together. They sat like that as the hours dissolved, two people who'd entered each other's lives through a business transaction and discovered somewhere between the fine print and the mac and cheese that what they'd built couldn't be contained by any contract ever written. When dawn broke through the kitchen window, they were still holding on. The hospital was everything Serena despised about institutions: bright, sterile, aggressively cheerful in a way that felt like an insult to everyone inside its walls who was terrified. Sophie was brave right up until the moment the prep nurses arrived with their syringes and their reassuring smiles and their gentle efficiency. Then her face crumpled like paper in a fist, and she started to cry. "I'm scared." Ethan climbed onto the gurney without asking permission, wrapping his daughter in his arms with the practiced tenderness of a man who'd been the sole source of comfort for 3 years. "I know, baby. I know you're scared, but you're the bravest person I know, and you're going to do great." "What if I don't wake up?" Serena moved to the other side and took Sophie's small hand. The fingers were cold. The monitor above them beeped in a rhythm that was slightly too fast, the signature of a heart that needed fixing. "You're going to wake up, and when you do, your daddy and I will be right here. Both of us. Both. Both of us." Sophie looked between them, her lashes wet and her eyes holding a trust so absolute it felt like a physical weight. "I love you. Both of you." Ethan's face contorted with the effort of not breaking in front of his daughter. "We love you too, sweetheart. So much." The anesthesiologist entered, kind but efficient, and within minutes Sophie's eyes were drooping, her grip on thunder, loosening her small body, surrendering to a chemical peace that was nothing like sleep and everything like preparation. The last thing she whispered before she went under was so quiet that Serena had to lean close to hear it, and when she did, the words embedded themselves in her chest like shrapnel. Don't leave me. Never. Though Sophie was already gone. They wheeled her away and Ethan stood in the hallway looking like a man whose skeleton had been removed. Serena took his arm and guided him to the surgical waiting room, a purgatory of harsh lighting, uncomfortable chairs, and other families wearing identical masks of controlled terror. Ethan paced for the first hour, collapsed into a chair for the second, put his head in his hands for the third. Serena sat beside him with her hand on his back, feeling completely helpless for the first time since she was 8 years old, and standing in a kitchen watching paramedics work on her mother's body and understanding with a child's terrible clarity that all the money and power in the world couldn't reverse what had already happened. Her phone buzzed. Patricia, final merger vote in 1 hour. Mercer attending in person. Your presence is required. The final merger vote, the entire reason this arrangement existed. 6 months of preparation, billions of dollars in projected value, her position as CEO hanging in the balance. Everything she'd worked for, sacrificed for, married, a stranger for, all of it coming to a head in a conference room 60 stories above Manhattan, while she sat in a plastic chair in a hospital waiting room in the Catskills, with sawdust on her sleeve from holding a carpenter who couldn't stop shaking. She stared at the message. She looked at Ethan, who hadn't noticed the phone, who was staring at the double doors through which his daughter had disappeared and would not look away until she returned. Serena turned off her phone. What was that? Ethan asked without looking up. Nothing important. He did look up then, and his devastated eyes found something in her face that made him pause. You just turned off your phone. You never turn off your phone. First time for everything. She said it lightly, but they both understood the weight. In the economy of Serena Whitfield's existence, her phone was an umbilical cord to the identity she'd spent her entire adult life constructing. Turning it off wasn't a gesture. It was an amputation. Tom arrived in the third hour carrying coffee and the particular brand of masculine support that expressed itself through presence rather than words. He looked at Serena, still in yesterday's clothes, makeup, smudged hair, escaping its twist, and raised his eyebrows. You look terrible. Thank you, Tom. Invaluable as always. I just mean, don't you have some corporate thing to be at? I'm exactly where I need to be. Tom looked at Ethan, looked at Serena. Something shifted behind his eyes, a recalibration, a grudging upgrade of an assessment he'd been running since the wedding. He sat down without another word, and the three of them waited together, bound by coffee and terror and the stubborn human refusal to let the people we love face the dark alone. Hour 4 arrived. Serena's phone, still off, buzzed with such persistent frequency inside her bag that even the nurse at the desk noticed. 17 missed calls from Richard, 9 from Patricia, a cascade of texts she could see piling up on the locked screen, each one more urgent than the last. Richard called again, and again, and again. Finally, because the buzzing had become a distraction, and distractions in a surgical waiting room felt obscene, Serena stepped into the hallway and answered, "Where the hell are you?" Her father's voice could have peeled paint. "You missed the vote. The merger vote, Serena. Mercer is threatening to walk. Do you have any idea what you've done?" The words that came out of her mouth surprised her as much as they surprised Richard. They arrived without rehearsal, without strategic calculation, without the careful cost-benefit analysis that had governed every significant utterance of her professional life. They came from the place where Sophie's hand had been small, cold, trusting, and from the place where Ethan had broken down in a workshop surrounded by sawdust and 30 years of carefully maintained stoicism, and from the place where her mother's pearl earrings rested against her neck like a pulse from another lifetime. I'm choosing something worth keeping, for the first time in my life. Then she hung up on her father, an act so unprecedented in the history of Whitfield family communications that it practically qualified as a constitutional amendment, and walked back into the waiting room and sat down next to the man whose daughter was being operated on because she'd written a check and whose heart was breaking in ways no check could fix. And she took his hand again, and they waited. Finally, after a duration that felt measured not in hours but in the aging of the earth itself, Dr. Shaw emerged from the surgical suite. She was a compact woman with steady hands and a smile that, when it appeared, functioned as a medical instrument more precise than any scalpel. The surgery went perfectly. The words landed like a defibrillator shock, jolting the room back to life. Sophie did beautifully. We repaired the septal defect and reinforced the valve. She'll need about a week for monitoring, but I expect a full recovery. Ethan made a sound that came from somewhere beyond language, a compound of relief and exhaustion and grief, finally permitted to transmute into something other than fear. Tom's hand landed on his brother's shoulder with the quiet force of an anchor. Serena's vision blurred and she let it, because some moments don't deserve to be seen clearly. They deserve to be felt. They were allowed into the ICU 32 minutes later. Sophie lay impossibly small in the hospital bed, surrounded by monitors displaying numbers that meant everything and meant nothing, her chest rising and falling with a steadiness that felt like a promise the universe was finally keeping. Ethan sat beside the bed, took her hand, spoke to her even though she was unconscious, because that's what fathers do. They speak to their children through every barrier the world erects, through sleep and distance and silence and fear, because the connection between parent and child operates on a frequency that doesn't require consciousness to transmit. You did it, baby. You were so brave. The doctor says you are going to be completely healthy. You can run and play and do everything. You're going to have a whole lifetime ahead of you. His voice fractured on the word lifetime. Serena stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder, and watched this man who'd sold a year of his life to ensure his daughter would have one, and thought, this is love, not a contract, not a transaction, not a strategic alignment of mutual interest. This, a father beside a bed at 2 in the morning, promising his child a future he'd purchased with the only currency he had, around 4 a.m. Serena convinced Ethan to rest in the parent room down the hall. Tom had left hours earlier, promising to return at dawn. The hospital had settled into its nocturnal hum machines, beeping nurses, padding through corridors, the building itself breathing with the measured rhythm of an institution designed to keep vigil while the world sleeps. Serena stayed with Sophie, held her hand, watched the monitor trace green mountains and valleys that represented a heart being rebuilt. At some point, exhaustion pulled her under, and she dozed in the chair beside the bed, her head tilted at an angle that would punish her for days. She woke to a touch, light, tentative, Sophie's fingers moving through her hair the way a child touches something precious and unfamiliar. Sophie's eyes were open, still heavy with medication but present, aware, alive. You stayed. I promised. Where's Daddy? Sleeping. Want me to get him? Sophie shook her head slowly. Not yet. Can you stay with me for a little while more? As long as you want. They sat together in the pre-dawn quiet, the monitor beeping its steady reassurance, the hospital corridor empty, the world outside the window beginning to lighten, from black to gray to the first tentative suggestion of blue. Sophie's hand tightened on Serena's, and when she spoke again, her voice was small and clear and carried the weight of a question that no contract had provisions for. Serena, are you my mom now? Like forever. The word forever landed in Serena's chest and detonated with the quiet devastation of something she'd been bracing for and was still completely unprepared to face. She thought about the document in her penthouse safe, its 20 pages of clinical language, governing the terms of a relationship that had long since exceeded its specifications. She thought about the timeline, 8 months remaining on an agreement that was supposed to be simple, and how that timeline now felt less like a schedule and more like a sentence. I care about you very much, Sophie, and I'm going to be in your life for as long as you want me there. It wasn't an answer. Sophie, 6 years old, recently operated on, still foggy from anesthesia, was smart enough to recognize evasion when she heard it. Her face shifted. Not dramatically, just a dimming. The way a light dims when someone adjusts a switch they didn't mean to touch. But you're not staying forever. I don't know what forever looks like yet, honey, but I know I'm right here, right now, and that's what matters. Sophie considered this with an expression far too old for her face. Then she nodded slowly and held Serena's hand tighter and closed her eyes and trusted that right now was enough, even though everything in her small, brave, recently repaired heart was already learning that it wasn't. The monitor beeped. The dawn advanced, and Serena Whitfield sat in a plastic chair in a hospital room in the Catskills, holding the hand of a child who'd asked her for forever, knowing that the contract gave her 8 months and understanding with a clarity that cut through every defense she'd spent 32 years constructing, that she was going to have to choose between the promise she'd signed and the promise she'd just made, and that no amount of strategic thinking or corporate maneuvering or carefully worded clauses could make both of those promises true. Sophie Calloway recovered the way she did everything else loudly and patiently and with complete disregard for medical protocol. Within 4 days, she was demanding discharge. By day 5, she'd lodged formal complaints about the food, the television selection, the temperature of the room, and the nurse's insistence on waking her up to confirm she was sleeping. By day 6, the hospital staff had developed a rotation system to manage her, not because she was difficult, but because her energy returning in waves like a tide reclaiming a beach exceeded the capacity of any single caretaker. Serena spent those days at the hospital, more hours than she spent anywhere else, including her own penthouse. She canceled meetings, rescheduled calls, delegated responsibilities to people she'd never trusted with anything larger than a stapler, and discovered that Whitfield Global Industries continued to function without her constant supervision, a revelation that should have been liberating and instead felt like finding out the house you'd devoted your life to building could stand perfectly well without the foundation you'd believe was essential. Patricia handled the discovery with diplomatic restraint, limiting herself to one raised eyebrow per day and the occasional pointed observation about corporate governance. On the 7th evening, Serena was alone with Sophie. Ethan had finally been persuaded to go home and shower. The man had been wearing the same flannel for 3 days, subsisting on vending machine coffee and the particular brand of paternal stubbornness that treats self-care as optional when your child is in a hospital bed. Sophie was propped up against pillows, drawing a picture of thunder with crayons. A nurse had provided her surgical scar hidden beneath a hospital gown, decorated with cartoon bears that she'd declared babyish but acceptable under the circumstances. The door opened, not with the brisk efficiency of a nurse or the cautious tenderness of Ethan returning early, but with the hesitation of someone entering territory they hadn't earned the right to occupy. Richard Whitfield stood in the doorway of the ICU room, and for the first time in Serena's memory, her father looked uncertain. "What are you doing here?" Richard's gaze moved from Serena to Sophie, to the monitors, to the crayon drawing, to the stuffed animals Tom had brought to the flowers from Mrs. Patterson, to the general disorder of a room that had been lived in rather than merely occupied. His expression navigated terrain Serena had never seen it cross discomfort, curiosity, and something buried so deep she almost missed it. Regret. "I came to see my daughter." He stepped inside, "and to meet the child she chose over $1 billion merger." "I didn't choose over anything. I chose what mattered." "Same outcome." Sophie looked up from her drawing. Her assessment of Richard Whitfield was immediate, unfiltered, and delivered with the casual authority of someone who'd already rendered judgment once and saw no reason to revise it. "You're the mean one from the wedding." Richard did something Serena had never witnessed in 32 years of close observation. He laughed. Not the performative chuckle he deployed in boardrooms, not the thin smile he offered at social functions. An actual laugh surprised out of him by a 6-year-old's refusal to observe the social contract that required people to pretend powerful men weren't exactly what they appeared to be. "Yes, I suppose I am. I'm sorry about that. I wasn't very welcoming." "It's okay." Sophie returned to her drawing with the magnanimity of someone who considered the apology adequate but not particularly interesting. "Serena says you're just scared of feelings. She says you love her, but you don't know how to show it. Is that true?" Richard looked at Serena. Something raw moved behind his eyes, the geological shift of emotional plates that hadn't moved in decades being forced into motion by the tectonic pressure of a child's honesty. "Yes, I suppose it is." He pulled a chair to the bedside. Not the power position, not the seat that commanded the room, or controlled the sightlines or established dominance over the conversation. Just a chair, close to a child he'd never met in a hospital he'd never visited, in a town he couldn't have found on a map 2 months ago. "Do you want to see my scar? It's going to be really cool when it heals. Daddy says it's a warrior scar." "I'd love to see it." Sophie carefully adjusted her gown to reveal the bandaged incision, presenting it with the pride of a soldier displaying a medal. Richard examined it with surprising seriousness, nodding with the gravity of someone who understood that this wound, this evidence of survival, deserved respect rather than pity. "Very impressive. You're very brave." "I know." Sophie grinned, then narrowed her eyes. "Are you going to be nicer to Serena now? Because she's really good and she works really hard and she makes me happy, And Daddy, too. Serena watched her father's face undergo a transformation she'd spent her entire life waiting for and had stopped believing was possible. The steel didn't disappear. Richard Whitfield would carry that steel to his grave, but something behind it shifted like a window opening in a room that had been sealed for years. Not wide, just a crack. But cracks under sufficient pressure could bring down entire walls. I'll try to be nicer. Good. Sophie picked up her crayon. You can stay and color if you want. I have extra crayons. Richard Whitfield, chairman of an $8 billion corporation, sat beside a 6-year-old's hospital bed and accepted a blue crayon with the gravity of a man receiving a peace offering he wasn't entirely sure he deserved. Serena watched from her chair, unable to speak because the scene in front of her belonged to a reality she hadn't known existed, one where her father colored with a child, where his hands that had signed mergers worth billions held a crayon worth nothing, where the most powerful man she knew submitted to the authority of someone who weighed 42 pounds and had opinions about the correct shade of blue for a horse named Thunder. He read to Sophie from a hospital storybook, his voice dropping into a register Serena had never heard, softer, slower, almost tender. Sophie listened with the critical ear of a connoisseur, interrupting twice to correct his character voices, and once to inform him that wolves didn't actually sound like that. She'd seen a documentary. When Ethan returned an hour later, freshly showered and still slightly damp, he stopped in the doorway and processed the scene before him with the visible recalibration of a man who'd accepted that this particular day was going to keep surpassing his capacity for surprise. Richard stood, extended his hand. I came to apologize. For the wedding, for the bank, for... He paused, searching for a word large enough to contain the scope of what he'd done and finding only inadequate ones. For how I've handled all of this. Ethan shook the hand. His grip was firm, his expression unreadable. Okay. And to tell you both that I spoke with Daniel Mercer this afternoon. Richard glanced at Serena, and his expression carried something unfamiliar, information delivered without calculation. He's agreed to proceed with the merger, despite the missed vote. Serena felt the ground shift beneath her feet for the second time in as many months. What apparently his own daughter missed his birthday last year for a merger negotiation, and he's regretted not saying something ever since. Your choice. Richard paused, and the next words seemed to cost him something he wasn't accustomed to spending. Your choice reminded him what actually matters. He said anyone who'd pick family over a board meeting is exactly the kind of person he wants running the combined company. The silence that followed was crowded with implications. The merger was alive. Serena's position was secure. The entire catastrophe she'd anticipated, the career destruction, the board revolt, the professional incineration, had been averted not by strategy or damage control, but by the one act that defied every principle of corporate management she'd ever learned, choosing the unprofitable option because it was the right one. Congratulations, Richard added, with a dryness that might have been humor or might have been something closer to wonder. You saved the merger by walking away from it. Sophie, who'd been following the conversation with the selective attention of someone monitoring adult behavior for signs of conflict, offered her assessment from the bed. I like him. He's not as mean as he seems. Everyone in the room registered, but nobody corrected Sophie's casual verdict. Something about it, the easy forgiveness of a child who judged people not by their worst moments, but by their willingness to show up and try again, completed whatever invisible process had been working on Richard since he'd walked through that door. Richard looked at Sophie, and his expression completed its journey from the familiar to the unprecedented. Your mother would have liked you, he said to Serena, not taking his eyes off the child. She always wanted grandchildren. The mention of Eleanor, whose name Richard hadn't spoken aloud in Serena's presence since the funeral, whose absence had shaped every room he'd entered for 24 years, hung in the air with the fragile weight of something irreplaceable being handled for the first time. Serena's hand went to her pearl earrings, involuntarily touching the only physical connection she had to a woman she remembered in fragments. The smell of baking, the sound of humming, the warmth of a lap she'd been too young to properly memorize before it was taken away. She would have, Serena managed. Richard left shortly after, but not before promising Sophie he'd visit again and asking whether she preferred dark or milk chocolate, because apparently he had a source for the best chocolate in Manhattan. Sophie requested both plus white, and Richard agreed to all three with the bemused compliance of a man who'd just discovered that his negotiating skills were no match for a first grader's. When the door closed behind him, Ethan turned to Serena with an expression that combined exhaustion, amazement, and the particular disorientation of someone who's been running on adrenaline for so long that the absence of crisis feels like a crisis in itself. Did that actually just happen? I think so. Your father read Sophie a book. I watched. And the merger is fine. Apparently. Ethan sat down heavily, the weight of the past week finally collecting its debt. This day has been completely surreal. Sophie's voice drifted from the bed, drowsy now, the medication pulling her back towards sleep. Serena, can you do my hair tomorrow? The nurses brushed it wrong, and it's all weird. I'll fix it first thing. Promise, promise. Sophie's eyes closed, and within minutes her breathing settled into the steady rhythm of a child who trusted the adults in her life to keep the world intact while she slept. Thunder sat on the bedside table, his blue and purple spots catching the fluorescent light. Standing guard, the way he'd been standing guard since the day Sophie painted him in a workshop yard, while a stranger in ruined shoes sat on a bench and drank coffee and began, without knowing it, to fall in love with a life she hadn't known she wanted. Sophie came home on a Wednesday. Tom had driven up from Pennsylvania to help, and the Havenbrook Welcome Committee, organized by Mrs. Patterson with the logistical precision of a military operation, had transformed the apartment above the workshop into a recovery ward disguised as a celebration. Balloons covered the ceiling. A banner in Tom's careful hand lettering read, "Welcome home, Sophie," in letters that were each a different color because Sophie had once mentioned that monochrome was boring for people who like boring things. The kitchen counter disappeared under casseroles, pies, soups, and a truly alarming quantity of baked goods contributed by residents Serena had never met, but who clearly loved the Callaways with the fierce, unquestioning loyalty that small towns reserve for their own. Mrs. Patterson stood in the kitchen doorway, surveying the chaos with the satisfaction of a general watching a successful invasion. She pressed a Tupperware container into Sophie's hands, chocolate chip cookies, still warm, and leaned down to the child's level with the particular gentleness of a woman who'd spent 70 years learning that kindness was the only currency that held its value. Welcome home, sweetheart. And remember, family isn't blood, child. Family is who shows up when it rains. Sophie accepted the cookies with the gravity they deserved and immediately began negotiating for a second container. That evening, after the visitors had finally departed and the apartment had settled into the particular quiet that follows a day of sustained joy, Serena found herself in the kitchen with Ethan, surrounded by enough food to sustain them for a month, in a silence that had been building for weeks, accumulating pressure. The way clouds accumulate moisture invisibly, inevitably, until something finally breaks. I should probably head back to Manhattan. She didn't move. I've been away from the office almost 2 weeks. You could stay. Ethan's voice carried the careful weight of someone placing a stone on a scale and watching to see which way the balance tipped. There's no rush. Ethan, I know there's an agreement. I know there's an expiration date. He moved closer, and the kitchen, which had never been large, contracted further. But Serena, we're way past pretending this is just a contract marriage. We can't do this right now. Sophie just got out of the hospital. Everything's emotional. We should stop. His hand found hers, and the contact sent a current through the careful insulation she'd been wrapping around her feelings since the night before the surgery. Stop making excuses. We've been dancing around this for months. At some point, we need to actually talk about what's happening. What's happening? As if it could be reduced to a phrase categorized, filed in the appropriate drawer of a well-organized emotional life. What was happening was that Serena Whitfield, who'd built an empire on control and spent 32 years perfecting the art of strategic detachment, had fallen for a carpenter who expressed love through furniture and a child who expressed truth through questions nobody else dared to ask. What was happening was that the contract she'd signed, the clean exit she'd negotiated, the professional distance she'd maintained like a levee against a rising river, had all been overwhelmed by a force she hadn't budgeted for actually wanting to be here. Not for the arrangement, not for the merger, not for any reason that could survive a cost-benefit analysis. For this, for them, for Thursday dinners and Saturday mornings, in the way Sophie said her name like it was a magic word that could summon good things. The words erupted from a place she'd kept locked since the day she'd found her mother on the kitchen floor and decided with the terrible logic of an 8-year-old that loving people was too dangerous because they could be taken away. You want to know what's happening? Fine. I'm terrified. I'm terrified that if I stay, you'll realize I'm not actually good at this. The family thing, the being a real person thing. I'm afraid Sophie will get hurt. I'm afraid my father will find some way to weaponize this. I'm afraid that if I let myself want this life, it'll be taken away like everything else I've ever cared about. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, wind moved through the bare trees with a sound like whispered counsel. Ethan stood close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, the fine lines at their corners that came from squinting in workshop light, the particular way his jaw set when he was about to say something that mattered. And I'm afraid that if you leave, I'll spend the rest of my life knowing I let the best thing that ever happened to me walk away because I was too scared to fight for it. He took her face in his hands, calluses against her cheekbones, the roughness of a man who worked with his hands, pressing against skin that had known nothing rougher than Egyptian cotton. I love you, Serena. Not the CEO, not the heiress, not the woman who wrote a check for my daughter's surgery. You. The person who learned to braid hair because a 6-year-old asked, who chose a hospital room over a boardroom, who reads to Sophie in terrible accents and helps her make disastrous mac and cheese and looks at both of us like we're the most important thing in your world. I love that person, and I'm done pretending I don't. Before Serena could respond, before the tears streaming down her face could find their way into words, a small voice materialized from the doorway with the devastating timing that only children and playwrights possess. Are you guys fighting? Sophie stood in her princess pajamas, thunder under one arm, her expression oscillating between worry and the particular alertness of someone who'd learned to monitor adult conversations for signs of seismic activity. Her eyes were wide, her lower lip engaged in preliminary trembling, and her gaze went straight to Serena with a directness that bypassed every defense. Are you going to leave, Serena? Is that what you're talking about? Sophie, sweetheart, it's complicated. Adults always say that when they don't want to tell the truth. Sophie's voice was small in a way that had nothing to do with volume. My friend Maya's parents said it was complicated right before her dad moved out. Are you moving out? I don't live here, sweetheart. I never did. I have an apartment in Manhattan. But you're here all the time. You have a toothbrush in our bathroom and clothes in Daddy's closet, and you make pancakes on Sundays. Sophie's tears began falling, each one a precise indictment of every adult who'd ever hidden behind the word complicated. You said you'd be in my life as long as I wanted. I still want you. Don't you want me anymore? Serena knelt, pulled Sophie into her arms, breathed in the strawberry shampoo and the hospital soap that still lingered, and the particular scent of a child who trusted you and was terrified that trust was about to be betrayed. I want you more than anything. You and your daddy both. So much it scares me. Then why are you leaving? Because sometimes adults make promises before they understand what they're really promising. And now I don't know how to keep all my promises at the same time. Sophie pulled back. Her eyes, Ethan's eyes, green and clear and incapable of pretense, searched Serena's face with an intensity that belonged to someone far older than 6. What promises? Serena looked at Ethan. He nodded. The time for careful choreography had passed. What remained was the truth, however jagged its edges. When your daddy and I got married, we made a business agreement. We said we'd be married for 1 year and then we'd get divorced. That was the plan from the beginning. Sophie's face collapsed. Not the dramatic crumple of a tantrum, but the slow, devastating implosion of understanding, the moment when a child comprehends something that permanently rearranges the landscape of their trust. So it's not real. Our family isn't real. Baby, that's not, Ethan started. You lied to me. Both of you lied. The marriage is real, Sophie. The feelings are real. Everything between us is real. It's just, but Sophie was already running, not toward her room, through the kitchen, down the stairs, out the back door, into the workshop, into the dark, into December. Ethan was moving before the door finished swinging Serena half a step behind, and the cold hit them both like a wall bitter sharp, the kind of Catskill winter night that punished every inch of exposed skin. Snow had started falling sometime in the past hour light, But determined and Sophie's footprints were visible in the thin white layer covering the workshop yard leading through the open door into the building where her father built things, and her mother's rocking chair still sat in the corner like a promise that had been kept by the wrong person. They found her curled in the rocking chair, Rachel's chair, hugging Thunder to her chest with both arms, her surgical scar hidden beneath princess pajamas, her small body shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deeper than a 6-year-old should have access to. The workshop was dark except for the security light outside the window casting long shadows across the workbenches and the half-finished furniture, and the child who'd wedged herself into the one piece in the building that still carried her mother's shape. Ethan reached her first, knelt beside the chair, his hands steady enough to cut a dovetail joint to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch were trembling. "Sophie, baby, come here. Mommy left me too." The words came out between sobs, each one tearing through the darkness. "Mommy said she'd always be here, but she couldn't stay. And now Serena's going to leave. Everybody leaves." The sound Ethan made was not one Serena had ever heard from a human being. Not grief, exactly not anger, but the particular agony of a parent confronting the knowledge that their child's deepest wound is the one they can't reach. He gathered Sophie into his arms, rocking chair and all, and held her against his chest while she cried into his flannel, with the abandon of someone who'd been told the world was safe and had just received evidence to the contrary. Serena knelt beside them. The concrete floor was cold through her jeans. Snow drifted past the window in the security light, and the workshop smelled like sawdust and linseed oil, in the particular loneliness of a building that had absorbed 3 years of a man's quiet desperation. "Your mommy didn't choose to leave Sophie." Ethan's voice was rough, scraped raw. "She wanted to stay more than anything in the world. The sickness took her. That wasn't her choice." "And Serena," Sophie lifted her face from Ethan's chest, cheeks, streaked eyes swollen, looking at the woman who'd braided her hair and sat beside her hospital bed and promised right here, right now, while silently acknowledging that right now had an expiration date. "Is Serena choosing to leave?" Serena opened her mouth to deliver the measured, careful, contractually accurate response she'd been constructing. What came out instead was the truth, unedited and unrehearsed, and carrying the full weight of 5 months of falling in love with two people she'd never expected and a life she'd never imagined. "I don't want to leave. I love your daddy and I love you. So much it terrifies me, and I don't know how to make everything fit yet, but I know that leaving isn't something I can do. Not anymore." Sophie looked at her father, looked at Serena. The calculation happening behind those green eyes was not the strategic assessment of an adult weighing options, but the simpler, more brutal arithmetic of a child determining whether the people in front of her could be trusted not to disappear. "Then don't go. Just stay. It's easy. Serena has a very important job in Manhattan, sweetheart. She can't just—" Actually, the word landed in the workshop like a match in a room full of kindling. "My father agreed that I could work from Havenbrook 3 days a week. What if I made that permanent Monday through Wednesday in the city, Thursday through Sunday here?" Ethan's expression traveled through surprise, hope, caution, and something that looked like the first tentative thaw of a winter that had lasted 3 years. "You'd do that? I'd do that, if you want me to. If we can figure out how to make this an actual relationship instead of a contract." He pulled both of them close. Serena felt Sophie's small body against her side and Ethan's arms around them both, and the cold concrete under her knees and the snow falling outside, and the particular physics of 3 people who had entered each other's orbits through paperwork and desperation, and had somehow improbably alchemized those base materials into something that felt permanent. "We'll figure it out." His voice vibrated through his chest into hers. "Together." 3 weeks later, on a January evening, cold enough to make the city itself seem to contract, Serena stood at a podium in the Whitfield Global Ballroom and addressed 200 of Manhattan's most influential citizens while wearing a midnight blue gown and the expression of a woman who'd stopped asking for permission. Ethan sat in the third row in his wedding suit, the only suit he owned, the only suit he needed, looking uncomfortable and determined in equal measure. Sophie occupied the seat beside him in a velvet dress, swinging her legs and periodically waving at Serena with an enthusiasm that the surrounding investment bankers and corporate attorneys found either charming or baffling, depending on their capacity for joy. "Thank you all for coming," Serena's voice carried through the ballroom with the clarity and command that 2 decades of practice had refined to an edge. As you know, the merger with Mercer Technologies was finalized last week, making this one of the most significant expansions in our company's history. But tonight I want to talk about a different kind of expansion. She outlined the initiative with the precision of someone who'd spent her career building cases and her recent months discovering why. Flexible scheduling for executives, remote work options, on-site childcare, parental leave for all employees, mothers and fathers, both. Every policy she had wished existed during the weeks she'd spent navigating boardrooms and bedtime stories, conference calls and cardiology appointments, the impossible calculus of trying to be present in two lives separated by 120 miles of highway. Some of you will think this makes us soft, that prioritizing family over constant availability will hurt our competitive edge. I'd argue the opposite. Our people are our greatest asset, and assets perform better when they're not exhausted and resentful, when they have lives worth living outside these walls. Silence, the kind that could tip toward applause or toward the polite, devastating quiet that follows a speech everyone disagrees with, but nobody wants to publicly oppose. Daniel Mercer stood up, 73 years old, built like a man who'd earned his weight through decades of working with his hands before working with his mind. He began to clap. His wife joined him. Then Tom, who'd driven down from Pennsylvania for the occasion and was seated near the back wearing a sport coat he'd clearly purchased that afternoon. Then Mrs. Patterson, who'd made the trip to Manhattan for the first time in 40 years and occupied her seat with the territorial confidence of someone who'd been navigating unfamiliar environments since before most of the room was born. The applause built, swept through the ballroom like a wave that started small and gathered mass. And by the time it crested, even the old guard, the Harold Pattons and Margaret Harrises, who'd spent their careers defending the architecture of constant availability, were clapping, if not from conviction, then from the recognition that the wind had shifted and survival required turning with it. When the speeches ended and the music began, Ethan found her near the champagne table. His expression held the particular combination of pride and bewilderment that characterized most of his experiences in Serena's world, the face of a man who understood the value of what had just happened, even if the specific mechanics of corporate galas remained mysterious. That was incredible. That was probably career suicide. The board will fight it. The board will adapt. He took her hand. Dance with me. You hate dancing. I hate a lot of things I'm willing to do for you. They moved to the floor. The music was slow. Not Sinatra this time. Something more modern, gentler, chosen by a DJ who understood that some moments required a soundtrack that stayed out of the way. Ethan still counted under his breath. He still overcorrected when he sensed his feet approaching hers. The earnestness of his effort remained entirely stubbornly, gorgeously intact. Halfway through the song, he reached into his jacket and produced a wooden box. Small, intricately carved with roses and vines in a pattern so detailed it must have consumed weeks of evening work, the kind of hours stolen from sleep and donated to intention. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, was a ring. Not the simple band she currently wore, the contract ring, the placeholder, the piece of jewelry that symbolized a transaction. This was something else. White gold inlaid with diamonds so small they looked like captured light, each stone set by hands that understood tolerances and pressure and the difference between forcing a material and persuading it. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Every facet caught the ballroom's ambient glow and redistributed it as something warmer, something that belonged to workshop light rather than chandelier light. I made it. His voice was quiet and the noise of the gala pitched for her alone. Took me 3 weeks to get the stone settings right. I'd never worked with metal that fine before. Had to learn as I went. It's not what you're used to. It's perfect. Her voice fractured on the second syllable. Ethan, you made me a ring. I made you a ring. He took her left hand and slid it onto her finger beside the wedding band. The two rings sat together, one purchased, one crafted, one representing a contract, the other representing its dissolution. I know we're already married, but that was for the arrangement. This is for what's real, for choosing to stay when you had every reason to leave, for loving Sophie like she's yours, for loving me when I'm covered in sawdust and can't dance and carry around grief like it's a piece of furniture I built and don't know how to put down. He paused, and when he continued, his voice had changed deeper, rawer, carrying the weight of something he'd been building toward for longer than 3 weeks. Longer than 5 months longer, perhaps than the 3 years since he'd sat beside Rachel's bed and promised to keep living, even though living felt like a betrayal of the dead. It took me a long time to believe I was allowed to feel this again. After Rachel, I thought that part of me went with her. That whatever I had left was supposed to go to Sophie in the workshop and the daily business of getting through. You showed me that wasn't true, that there was still room. That building something new didn't mean demolishing what came before. Serena looked at the ring on her finger, imperfect and handmade, and worth more than everything in her penthouse combined because it had been built by someone who understood that the most valuable things in the world weren't bought, but built weren't acquired, but earned weren't owned, but shared. Serena Whitfield Calloway, will you stay married to me, not for a contract or a merger or corporate strategy, but because we're building something real and I don't want to build it with anyone else? Yes. The word came out whole and unguarded and uncontracted, the first completely undefended thing she'd said since she was 8 years old. Yes, I'll stay married to you. They kissed in the middle of the dance floor while 200 people watched, and Sophie cheered from her table with a volume that made several nearby wine glasses vibrate sympathetically. Richard sat beside Sophie, and when Serena caught his eye over Ethan's shoulder, her father gave the smallest nod. She'd ever seen a movement so restrained. It might have been involuntary, might have been imagined, but wasn't either. It was acknowledgement, not of the merger or the gala or the corporate implications of his daughter's public declaration. Acknowledgement of something simpler and harder, that Serena had found what Richard had lost, and he was choosing for the first time in 24 years not to punish her for succeeding where he'd failed. Just over a year had passed since the wedding. Spring dissolved into summer. The Catskills erupted in green so aggressive it bordered on confrontational, as if the mountains were personally offended by winter and intended to demonstrate the full extent of their recovery. Serena stood in the doorway of Callaway Woodcraft and watched Ethan teach Sophie how to use a handsaw. They were building a bookshelf for her room, a project that had consumed 3 times the necessary hours because Sophie insisted on participating in every step, from selecting the wood to measuring the cuts, to sanding the surfaces with a focus that suggested she believed the bookshelf's quality would be judged by a panel of invisible experts. The workshop had expanded. What had been a struggling one-man operation when Serena's car broke down 9 months ago was now a thriving small business specializing in handcrafted children's furniture and toys, each piece made with the same precision Ethan had always employed, but now produced with sustainable materials and ethical practices that Serena had introduced. They'd hired 2 additional craftsmen, young guys from the next town over, whom Ethan was training with the patient thoroughness of someone who understood that skills were the only inheritance that couldn't be taxed or devalued or taken away. A 3rd apprentice was starting next month. Orders arrived from across the country, driven by features in magazines focused on artisan goods and conscious consumption. The business generated revenue, not Manhattan money, but enough to be self-sustaining and growing enough to prove that craftsmanship and commercial viability weren't mutually exclusive enough to validate the hypothesis that had always been embedded in Ethan's work, that people would pay for things made with care by hands that understood what they were touching. Ethan guided Sophie's small hands on the saw, his voice low and instructive, explaining grain patterns and blade angles and the importance of respecting the material. You judge people by how they treat the ones who can't do anything for them. He told her apropos of nothing and everything, and Sophie nodded with the seriousness of someone receiving essential intelligence about the operation of the world. Serena split her time exactly as she'd proposed, Monday through Wednesday in Manhattan, running Whitfield Global with the same precision she'd always brought to the work, but without the soul-crushing hours. Thursday through Sunday in Havenbrook, where the maple desk sat by the window and the apartment had gradually absorbed her presence, the way good wood absorbs oil, slowly completely improving the grain. Her penthouse in the city had become a hotel she visited 3 nights a week. The 16 rooms felt excessive in a way they hadn't before, as if the apartment itself had developed self-awareness and was embarrassed by its own proportions. She'd started leaving lights off in rooms she didn't use, and the resulting darkness didn't feel like neglect. It felt like honesty. Richard visited Havenbrook once a month. The first visit had been awkward. Richard Whitfield navigating a small town with the cautious bewilderment of a deep-sea creature brought to the surface. By the third visit, he'd established a chess ritual with Sophie that involved more trash talk than strategy, and occasionally deteriorated into arguments about whether knights could move backwards, a question on which Sophie held strong and historically inaccurate opinions. He argued politics with Ethan in a tone that an outsider might have mistaken for hostility, but that both men recognized as the particular frequency of respect between two people who disagreed about almost everything and had decided to enjoy the disagreement rather than resolve it. Richard was still difficult, still calculating, still capable of a remark so precisely barbed that it drew blood before the target realized they had been struck. But he was trying. He'd started dating a woman named Helen, a museum curator, who'd met him at a benefit and committed the unprecedented act of telling him he was wrong about something. He'd been so startled by the experience that he'd asked her to dinner, and she'd been so amused by his startlement that she'd accepted, and somewhere between the first course and dessert, they discovered a mutual appreciation for honesty that was rarer in their respective worlds than either had realized. Thursday evening, the kitchen table, the ritual, Sophie narrating her day with the editorial expansiveness of a child who believed every detail was equally significant. Ethan contributing updates about commissions and apprentices and the ongoing war with the county zoning board over workshop expansion. Serena sharing the filtered version of corporate life that was appropriate for family dinner, and finding increasingly that the unfiltered version held less interest for her than it once had. They cleaned up in formation. Ethan washing, Serena drying, Sophie providing silverware storage with running commentary, delivered in the style of a cooking show host explaining technique to an invisible audience. Then the living room where Sophie produced her latest school project with the barely contained excitement of someone about to unveil a masterpiece. A family tree, drawn in crayon on poster board with the careful lettering of a first grader who'd spent extra time because this particular assignment mattered more than most. At the center, Sophie Calloway, branching above Daddy Ethan Calloway and Mom Serena Whitfield Calloway. Not stepmom, not Daddy's wife. Mom. Is that okay? Sophie's voice carried the particular anxiety of someone who'd made a bold decision and was now facing the possibility that boldness might not be welcome. Mrs. Patterson said I should ask first, but you feel like my mom, so I wanted to put you there. Serena's vision blurred. She thought about the contract, about the word temporary, about every carefully constructed boundary she'd erected between herself and the two people standing in front of her, holding a poster board that contained in crayon the only organizational chart that had ever mattered. It's more than okay. I'd be honored to be your mom. Really? Sophie's entire face ignited. Because Maya said you're not my real mom since you didn't birth me. But Daddy said family is about who shows up and who loves you, not about biology. Your daddy is absolutely right. He usually is. Sophie grinned and then leaned in conspiratorially. Don't tell him I said that. Serena reached for her pearl earrings. Eleanor's earrings, the ones she'd worn to a wedding and touched when she was nervous and never removed because they were the only thing she had of her mother's, and losing them would be losing the last physical proof that Eleanor had existed. She unclasped them carefully. The weight left her earlobes with a sensation like releasing a breath she'd been holding for 24 years. These belonged to my mother, your grandmother Eleanor. She would have loved you so much. She fastened them on Sophie's small ears. They were too large, too elegant for a 6-year-old in pajamas, and they were absolutely perfect. They're yours now. Sophie touched the pearls with reverent fingers, understanding instinctively that she was holding something whose value couldn't be measured in the currencies she knew, not in dollars, not in cookies, not even in the sophisticated barter economy of first-grade social politics. She was holding inheritance, the physical manifestation of a line that ran from a woman she'd never meet through the woman kneeling before her, to the child she was becoming, connected by something stronger than blood, or contracts, or the legal definitions of family that adults used to constrain what children knew by instinct was boundless. I'll be really careful with them. I know you will. Later that night, after Sophie had fallen asleep with Thunder in one arm and the earrings carefully placed on her nightstand like relics in a personal museum, Ethan and Serena sat on the porch. The evening was warm, that particular July warmth that carried the scent of cut grass and distant honeysuckle, and the general contentment of a season that had nothing to prove. Stars were appearing slow and certain, populating the sky, with a patience that made Manhattan's perpetual luminescence seem not impressive, but desperate. Ethan reached for her hand, their fingers interlaced with the automatic ease of a gesture that had been repeated enough times to graduate from conscious decision to involuntary reflex. The contract expired a couple of months ago. His voice was quiet, observational rather than emotional, stating facts the way a carpenter states measurements precisely because precision is how you honor the material. I know. We never signed the divorce papers. I know that too. So technically, we're just married. No expiration date, no exit strategy, no fine print. Terrifying, isn't it? Absolutely. He pulled her closer. The porch swing creaked in a rhythm that matched the crickets. Best decision I ever made, though, saying yes to a crazy woman whose car broke down. Best decision I ever made, proposing to a carpenter I'd known for 17 minutes. They sat in the kind of silence that only people who've survived something together can share. Not empty silence, but full silence, occupied by everything they'd been through and everything they'd chosen, and the particular peace that comes from no longer needing words to communicate what matters. Thank you. Serena's voice was soft enough to be part of the evening rather than an interruption of it. For staying, for choosing this even when it was messy and complicated and nothing like what either of us planned. Thank you for teaching me that messy and complicated can be worth it, that real love doesn't live in contracts or timelines, that sometimes the best things happen when you stop trying to control everything and let yourself feel. He kissed her, gentle, unhurried, the kind of kiss that doesn't need to prove anything because it already contains everything. Inside the apartment, Sophie slept with her hand curled around pearl earrings that had traveled from a woman who died too young, through a daughter who'd spent her life building walls to a granddaughter who'd spent her 6 years tearing them down. In Manhattan, Whitfield Global operated under policies that valued the people inside the building as much as the numbers on the screens. In the workshop below the porch, orders waited for furniture that would be built by hands that understood their material shipped to homes across the country, each piece carrying the invisible signature of a man who'd learned that craft wasn't just about joining wood, it was about joining lives. And on this porch in Havenbrook, while rain began to fall, soft, warm summer rain that tapped against the workshop windows with the same rhythm that had once beaten against the boardroom glass. 60 stories above Manhattan, Serena Whitfield Calloway sat beside her husband and listened to the sound and understood that it was the same rain. The same water cycling endlessly between sky and earth, between falling and rising, between one life and another. The rain didn't know the difference between a boardroom and a workshop, between a penthouse and a porch, between a contract and a family. It just fell, everywhere, on everything, connecting every surface it touched. She'd come to this small town desperate and cornered, looking for a business solution to a corporate problem. She'd found something the business schools didn't teach, and the contract hadn't covered that the most valuable things in life, the ones that actually appreciate over time, that can't be depreciated or amortized or written off, are the things you build with your hands and your heart and your willingness to stay when leaving would be easier. The rain fell, the stars hid behind clouds and would return when the clouds moved on, because stars are patient and clouds are temporary, and the sky has room for both. Sophie's repaired heart beat steady and strong in a body that was growing toward a future purchased by a father's sacrifice, in a stranger's recklessness, in a child's insistence that family was simple even when adults made it complicated. And Serena, who'd spent her life building walls, negotiating distances, and converting every human connection into a transaction with clearly defined terms and a predetermined exit, held her husband's hand in the rain and knew with a certainty that no quarterly report had ever provided that she was finally, irreversibly, completely home.